Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I call Richard Callard, please?
Yeah.
Bible in your right hand. Repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
should be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Next.
Good morning, Mr. Callard. My name is Jason Beer, as you know, and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Can you tell us your full name, please?
Richard John Callard.
Thank you. You've made a long witness statement, 173 pages, excluding the exhibit sheets, dated the 14th of June 2024. The URN for that is WITN 0014-0100. If we can have that up on the screen, please, and look at the bottom of page 23. Right at the bottom. Thank you. You see the last line on the page going into the next page. It currently reads, by this time, Jenny Willett MP had replaced Joe Swinson MP whilst Joe Swinson MP was on maternity leave. Is there a correction which you would like to make to that sentence?
Yes, please. I realised after I read Joe Swinson's witness statement that she had returned from maternity leave in June. So it should read that by this time Joe Swinson had returned from maternity leave.
If you could just angle those microphones, thank you, and then just move forward a little bit. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So the sentence should read, by this time, Joe Swinson had returned from maternity leave.
That's correct.
Thank you. And if you can turn, please, to page 173.
Yep.
Is that your signature?
It is.
And with that correction brought into account, are the contents of the witness statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. You can put that to one side, thank you. Can I start with your background, please? In summary terms, is this right? You qualified as a chartered accountant in 2001 and joined Arthur Andersen, as it then was, in 2002.
That's correct.
You joined the shareholder executive, SHEEX, as we're going to call it, initially on secondment in March 2007 and then permanently from March 2009.
That's correct.
You started to lead the SHEEX post office team in January 2014 and were appointed as the shareholder non-exec director for the post office in March 2014.
That's correct.
And so you had two roles, head of the shareholder team within SHEEX and the shareholder NED for the post office.
Yes, that's correct.
You held the post office board role until March 2018 and the head of the shareholder team role for post office until May 2018.
That's correct.
You remain an executive director of UKGI, the successor organisation to SHEEX.
That's correct.
Thank you. Can I start then by asking you some questions about the role that you performed as a non-executive director,
Yep.
as a NED?
Mm-hmm.
And these questions are based on what you say in paragraphs 8, 13 and 14 of your witness statement. There's no need to turn them up. You say that when you started working working at the post office as a non-executive director, you first had no experience as a NED, is that right?
That's correct.
You second had little knowledge of the post office.
I suppose I'd had a 2-month run-in as leader of the shareholder team, noting that I'd been on paternity leave as well, but yes.
And third, you say that you found your new role as head of the SHEEX team for the post office overwhelming, in particular because that role had been split previously between two people.
That's correct.
Did you ever raise your concerns about your capacity or capability to undertake the role of a non-executive director on the Post Office Board?
No, because to start with, I thought I'd see how it went, and if I could manage. I was doing 50%, theoretically 50% of my time on the Green Investment Bank shareholding, 50% of my time on the Post Office shareholding, and then the non-executive role was a sort of, I'm not sure whether it was considered part of the 50% of the Post Office, but the way UKGI and Shecs works is that you tend to have everybody has quite a full workload. So whilst I say it was overwhelming, it was, but I think it was more about the sheer number of issues that were on the agenda as opposed to the level of workload.
Having taken on the role for which you had no prior experience, did you receive any relevant training or mentoring?
Not particularly. I went on a course with regard to being a NED, and clearly I'd picked up snippets and experience from other people, but there was nothing particularly formal to start with.
Even though you were new to the role of a non-executive director, at this early stage, did you at least know that a core part of the role of a board would be to provide appropriate challenge to the thinking and strategy of the executive of a company?
Yes.
Did you understand that the non-executive director, the NED's role within that function, was in particular to provide independent oversight?
Yes.
And a constructive challenge to the executive directors?
Yes.
When you took up the role, did you have any understanding or recognition of the risk inherent in an organisation dealing with long-standing challenges, that they, or the organisation, may develop entrenched views, sometimes called groupthink?
Well, I certainly heard of groupthink, and clearly there's always a bit of history, but I don't think I had any specific worries about that in that sense. There was, when I joined it, although Post Office is, 300 odd years old, it had only just come out from under Royal Mail and had a relatively new board, which it never had before. So everybody on that board was pretty new to Post Office.
Does it follow that you didn't regard it as a particular function of your job as a non-executive director to be alive to that risk of ingrained thinking or groupthink and be the one that ought to identify it and challenge it?
I don't recall thinking that way specifically. But I was aware that that is what my role was, and I did ask questions about a whole range of topics as part of my role.
You do mention in your witness statement that you asked questions over the years that you fulfilled the function of NED. But in your witness statement, you don't appear to identify any point at which you provided any significant challenge to the executive. Would you agree?
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
Which were the occasions when you significantly and directly challenged the executive?
Are you talking about Horizon specifically or generally?
Horizon specific.
Well, I think I asked questions around whether people had appealed, because I couldn't understand why people, if there'd been miscarriage of justice, why people hadn't appealed.
Just stopping there, isn't that a request for information rather than a challenge to the approach or direction that the company was taking?
Yes, I suppose you're right. Yeah.
I'm thinking about challenging and saying what you're doing, in my view, is wrong. It's the wrong path to take. I would vote for. I suggest you do X.
I suppose when I got there, I inherited a position which was I felt relatively established. There had been, Second Sight had been appointed in some time in 2012. They had then produced a report in July 13. I thought Post Office's response to the findings of that report in terms of setting up a business improvement programme, setting up a mediation scheme, where individual cases would be looked at, and also looking at prosecutions, was a reasonable response to the information that was being received at the time. So I was relatively satisfied with what was going on at that point, and I also received the information I was getting from the team that I inherited was similar. So I'm not sure I felt the need to directly challenge in that way, because there was quite a bit of work and investigation already ongoing in terms of individual cases within the mediation scheme being investigated. And periodically we then, there was things around Deloitte, there was Linklaters, etc. And I also volunteered to join the Sparrow subcommittee because I was quite clear that ministers would want to understand what was going on. So whilst I can't think of any examples that were directly challenging, I think that's a reflection of the fact that at the time that I joined, it didn't feel that I particularly needed to.
And so was that state of being relatively satisfied, or being in a state of relative satisfaction, one that continued for the entirety of your role as a NED?
No. I think we were continually worried about the issue of Sparrow, as I'll probably call it, throughout today.
I'm looking, sorry to speak over you, Mr. Callard. You've mentioned asking for information. Mm-hmm. You said that you were worried or concerned.
Yeah.
I'm asking, was there any occasion when you actively challenged the executive?
There will have been, but I can't remember specific examples. But at the Sparrow subcommittee, that is where the forum would be to ask specific questions of the executive. A lot of those were focused around how, by the time I got there, because of what the information I understood it to be around the system itself, was around how we deal with the problems that the mediation scheme was happening. I mean, on reflection, knowing what I know now, I probably should have asked more probing questions about the specifics of the IT itself. But as I say, the position I inherited felt a relatively good position, although even though the mediation scheme itself was starting to somewhat go awry.
Did you see your role as the SHEX representative on the board to represent the interests of taxpayers?
Yes, I think so. It was to represent the role of a shareholder NED, to my mind, is one of, aside from being an independent NED in its own right, it also has an overlay of bringing government perspective to the board and bringing the board's perspective to the government so that they can understand each other better.
You tell us in your witness statement, it's paragraph 39, that you did not see the responsibilities of the board of directors as being fundamentally different in Post Office to those that would ordinarily apply to the board of a large company, simply by virtue of the fact that the company was wholly owned by the government. Can I ask, given that the Post Office was effectively spending public funds, did you not consider that there was a greater accountability on Post Office than in the case of a private commercial entity?
I suppose we view, almost in some respects, somewhat neutral about who owns the business itself. But we do feel accountable to taxpayers in terms of how money is spent and what it goes on. That's not to say that we don't want money to be spent. It's more about value for money. Are you getting what you're paying for? So we do have in mind. I did have in mind an eye to things like costs, but also
that would apply in a. Sorry to speak over you again. That would apply in a straightforward commercial company.
Yes, and I don't really see there's it wouldn't be that different to a commercial company. The way SHEX works is to almost treat its businesses, to the extent it can, as commercial entities, because that's what we want them to be. Now they're in SHEX or UKGI because there's something, they can't quite be commercial. So in Post Office's case, for example, they have to keep open 3,000 branches that would otherwise be unviable. But otherwise, we want them to operate like a commercial entity, and through SHEX, that's kind of the sort of culture we're trying to bring.
So you could have been selling oil or making microchips it didn't matter that this was public money being spent in
Well,
the
well, of
provision of a public service?
Well, of course it matters, and you always have an eye to the fact that you're ultimately responsible through to Parliament. That so you want to make sure it gives an extra angle, as it were, when you're looking at business cases about money, that you know that the money that you've got to get won't otherwise go into a hospital or a school. So there is that angle. So one does think of the taxpayer, and that is the added angle that you bring, I suppose, as a non-exec, a shareholder non-exec, because you've got to think about the wider spending position of the department and the wider priorities.
Can I turn to potential conflicts of interest? In paragraphs 10, 16, 63 and 317 to 19 of your witness statement, you discuss the potential conflict of interest which the Post Office board perceived to exist between the Post Office on the one hand and the government as Post Office's shareholder on the other. And you give a specific example of board discussions of government funding levels as posing a problem.
Yeah.
You indicate that you were conscious of the potential for you personally to be placed in a position of conflict of interest, and therefore decided to absent yourself from certain parts of certain board meetings, particularly when funding was discussed. Agreed?
That's correct.
Can you explain what specifically the perceived conflict was, please, in relation to the Post Office's funding?
So, as a non-executive director, you are there to promote the interests of the company, and I suppose in a crude way, the more investment that you get, the better it is for the company. With your civil service hat on, clearly you're there to look after public funds. You want to make sure that the right amount of money goes to the Post Office or any other business that you look after. And you're also very conscious that there is limits on the level of taxpayer funding that can go to the Post Office versus any other. So those two things somewhat conflict, not all the time, but they do somewhat conflict when the board is making decisions about what it's applying to government for. And I remember it was at one particular board meeting, I think it was a strategy away day, where Post Office proposed a number which I thought was just far too big, and I said so. And as a team, as a shareholder team, a lot of our efforts over the course of the next 12 to 18 months were around pushing that figure down in one direction, and yet at the same time, when we went to the department, explaining to the department why Post Office needed that investment. And so you're trying to bring down their expectations and get comfortable with the level of funding that, as a shareholder team, you think Post Office needs for what it wants to do, whilst at the same time going into bat with the department to say, we think you need to provide X 100 million to Post Office to provide them with these.
So when you said that number's too high,
yes,
which hat were you wearing?
Well, I often in boards would say which hat I was wearing. Yeah. I specifically say, and I think I.
So on that occasion.
So on that occasion, I think I will have said, look, this number is too high for government, and no one's countenancing that.
So why were you entitled to say that if you thought that there was a conflict of interest in representing government's views on funding issues within the board?
So I didn't quite understand the question.
Yes. Why? You told us that there was a conflict of interest.
Yep.
On occasion.
Yes.
In particular in relation to funding.
Yep.
Because the board's overall aim, this is describing things in very generic terms,
yes,
would be to secure from government the highest level of funding that was possible.
Yep.
That would not
within reason.
Yes. That would not necessarily be government's number one choice or priority.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you said in a board meeting that number is too high, were you saying that as the government's representative?
Yes, and I probably was saying it as well as a shareholder, Ned. I suppose knowing, understanding the government context. So whether I actually said I'm putting my government hat on specifically, but I just felt that I wanted to set expectations that figure felt quite high. Now,
So
I
hold on,
didn't see that was a conflict in saying that at the time. Well, there was lots of discussions about funding within the Post Office Board. I think I recused myself from 2 discussions. Now, the reason why I recused myself in those particular discussions was because I could tell, I could pick up the feeling from the board, but the discussions that was going to happen then was more about the tactics and of the board as to what they're going to do, given that government is not giving them the money that they wanted. And I don't think they felt comfortable, and I didn't feel comfortable in discussions around, okay, so what's our next move with government? I didn't feel comfortable being in that discussion. I don't think they felt me being comfortable there because they weren't sure what I would take back to the department. There were plenty of discussions that we did have where I was in the room about funding, about what is this money for, what's the business cases for, is this the right direction, etc. So sorry if I've given the impression that I was never in the room of the board for funding discussions. There were plenty of funding discussions, but there were some specific times that I recused myself because I wasn't comfortable being there and the board wasn't comfortable with me being there.
Can you give us any other examples of specific areas where the board considered there to be a conflict of interest or potential conflict of interest in you acting both as a board member and also as a member of the shareholder executive?
Not particularly, to be honest. I mean, some members... I was the first shareholder, Ned, that was also part of the shareholder team. So my predecessor, Susanna Story, had been separate to Shex. Although she had been a Shex person, she was ex-Shex. So I remember there was a bit of discomfort when I first joined, and I think there was a concern about the sharing of board papers and those sorts of sort of procedural issues, which I suppose you could say is some sort of conflict there. I'm not sure what they wanted. Boards tend to be very sensitive about...
Specifically, Mr. Callard,
Yep.
Did you or any other board members perceive any conflict or potential conflict in relation to Horizon issues on any occasion?
No, I don't think so.
Did you feel constrained in any way in disclosing information by reason of your signature of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements?
No, because that NDA agreement was specifically, I think, worded to allow me to share board papers with my team and others in government if I felt it appropriate.
So the NDAs did not inhibit your ability to relay any matters of concern about Post Office to government?
No.
You tell us in paragraph 42 of your witness statement about circumstances in board meetings where you spoke with, quote, your Ned hat on or your government stroke shareholder hat on, as you described. And you say that you might, for example, state that you agreed with the board's course of action given what you knew from board discussions and your responsibilities as a Ned to the company, but would make it clear that ministers might not necessarily agree.
Yeah.
What did you understand, in your words, your responsibilities as a Ned to the company to mean?
So you're there to promote the success of the company. So if I could give an example that might demonstrate that. So there were, for example, there were redundancy programs periodically to be done in the post office to make them more efficient. So, for example, in the cash supply chain, which was felt to be overmanned. And so, as a Ned, I was quite content, having looked at the business case for it, that for those redundancies to go through. But clearly, redundancies are a politically sensitive matter. And so I would say, well, as a Ned, using my independent judgment, I would agree with this change, but what we do need to do is inform the minister because it could have political ramifications. It's not that they'll say no, but I need to warn them, and we just need to make sure there's no objection.
You give examples in your witness statement where you might be wearing two hats and had to make clear that fact as including issues of executive remuneration, mutualisation, funding, pension changes and Sparrow. In what ways did you believe your duties as a director were not or may not have been aligned with the interests of the government, its sole shareholder, in relation to Sparrow?
It's less about not being aligned, it's just not really understanding the ministerial position and go back for clarification. So I'm thinking specifically around some of the decisions that the Sparrow subcommittee were looking at, say, towards the start of June and the end of April, where there were worries and concerns about the investigations into each case of mediation not proceeding quick enough and sort of almost getting stuck with second sight because they were only 2 people versus the investigatory team at Post Office that had 20. And so the options that were put forward by the executive and discussed by the subcommittee, it was acknowledged that to the extent that the board decided to do something, you'd have to go back to ministers, particularly given the parliamentary undertakings they had made about second sight, for example, to say, well, we would need ministerial consent or whatever to take a course of action. So whilst I could, as a NED, say, well, I think this is perhaps the right way forward because clearly X and Y is happening and this looks like the right course of action, I don't know how a minister feels about that. They may say yes, they may say no to it, but we've got to be live to that sort of thinking. So that's kind of what I meant by that particular example.
You tell us in paragraph 61 to 62 of your witness statement that you shared the, quote, vast majority of information you received in your capacity as a shareholder NED with the shareholder team without restriction, correct?
Yes.
Did you take the same approach, i.e. sharing the vast majority of information in relation to ministers and civil servants outside of SHEX?
No, not in that way, because the stuff that you get through from board packs would be 150 to 250 pages. You wouldn't share those with the minister. They haven't got to. Did
you consider there to be a restriction of a different kind in sharing information that you learned in your capacity as shareholder NED outside of the SHEX team?
No, I never felt there was the things that I couldn't tell ministers if I felt it appropriate to do so.
So you were able, you thought, to show board papers to ministers and civil servants outside of SHEX if the occasion arose?
I very rarely shared board papers outside of SHEX because I never felt there was a need to. What we would do if there was something to be said, we would put that into some sort of submission or some sort of email.
Yes.
And circulate it rather than actually sharing the paper itself.
So never mind how the information was conveyed, you considered yourself able to inform ministers and civil servants outside of SHEX of the substance and detail of Post Office board decisions without restriction?
Yes, whether I did or not, it comes down to my judgment at the time and what the matter is and what I think people's views are. But yes, I never felt I couldn't share the gist of it and the content of it. I wouldn't necessarily share the papers themselves.
You said that you shared the vast majority of information you received in your capacity. Can you give us some examples of information that didn't fall within the vast majority?
I was actually thinking there of pensions, the pension subcommittee. So when I first joined Post Office, I was asked to go on the pension subcommittee, which was looking specifically at closing the defined benefits pension scheme because a deficit was emerging. There was no one on my team, particularly at that point, that really understood pensions. I'd dealt with pensions under Royal Mail. So I don't recall particularly sharing, until we got to the point where there was going to be an announcement about it, particularly sharing any pension subcommittee.
That wasn't because of a restriction, though. That was just because the
exactly. So
circumstances didn't warrant it.
Quite.
So information could be shared, in your view, that you learnt in your capacity as shareholder NED, through attending meetings, through reading board papers, and otherwise, without restriction with ministers and civil servants.
Yeah, I would filter that, but yes.
But the filter you applied was not because of any
restriction. No, restriction. To do with my judgment and what I think people know and what I felt was relevant.
You tell us in paragraph 69 of your witness statement that you found it difficult to identify the correct balance when it came to the appropriate level of government engagement on the Horizon issue. What did you mean by that?
I think, sorry about seeing the paragraph. I think the position I inherited was that...
We can look at the paragraph to help you.
Well, I can just...
It's page 35.
35, thank you. Should have brought my...
It'll come up on the screen, page 35.
Yeah, so I think I explain it in the paragraph.
Just wait for it to come.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Page 35, paragraph 69. And it's the sentence which I just read in the first line. I found it difficult, in general terms, to identify the correct balance when it came to the appropriate level of government engagement on the Horizon.
Yeah. So, not unlike other arm's length bodies I've dealt with prior to that and was dealing with at the time, there's a balance between operational independence of that body because it's a specialist body, and the desire sometimes of ministers and of government to intervene and do things. And I think on Sparrow that was a particularly difficult one because you had some very difficult stories. It was in the news a lot.
Sorry, what do you mean that you had some very difficult stories?
Oh, sorry. Well, the position of sub-postmasters, as articulated by the story, their experiences that were in the news, were obviously very distressing, and there's a natural inclination, I think, of government and particularly of ministers to want to do something. But on the flip side, there is a business there which is operationally. Maybe operationally independent, but also specialist. It's business, and trying to think about what ministers or what civil servants like me could actually do, given it was quite a sort of technical topic. It's quite a difficult balance, and I think throughout my time, it was a constant balance between trying to keep at arm's length and from it, because realistically there was not much that I didn't think that ministers could realistically do, whilst at the same time trying to make sure that Post Office are doing the right thing and understanding what's going on at their end. And I just found that quite a difficult balance. I think in part because we never quite, sadly, and I regret it, we never quite got to the bottom of whether there was where the problem was. There were lots of investigations, and each time there was an investigation, it came back that wasn't really an issue. And there were investigations throughout my time. There was the mediation scheme, there was the Parker review, and then the litigation. And throughout that, we were, particularly up to the litigation, we weren't really getting any particular news that there was a particularly identifiable issue with Horizon which caused losses to sub-postmasters. And without that link, it's very difficult to then do something.
Do you think, Mr. Callard, that's a result of not looking hard enough? Because now you've looked at some of the papers themselves, i.e., you've looked at all of the Second Sight reports, you've looked at the Parker review itself rather than a letter summarising it. You've looked in detail at the Deloitte reports rather than summaries of them. And you've discovered a whole host of information that puts an entirely different complexion on things.
Yes, it does. So clearly, I was not curious enough. I mean, that's probably self-evident. But as I said, there was always some form of investigation going on. There'd been 18 months of investigation before I got there. And I think the problem I sort of had in some respects was that, and you can see this in some of the papers by the time we get to December 14, early 15, and that represents, about 2 years' worth of investigation. What we're getting back is that there isn't an issue with the IT. And so you get to the point, well, every time we do a review, it says there isn't something there, and you're almost in the zone of trying to prove a negative, that there isn't a problem. And I never thought that was ever going to be very easy to get to, which is why I always thought we need to it needs to go to court. Because
that view might be said to be fatalistic.
Quite possibly, but I mean, but
does that fairly represent?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by fatalistic in that sense.
I.e., this needs to be litigated by the parties and truly independent view taken by a member of the judiciary?
Well, it wasn't that it needed a truly independent view, because I thought we were getting independent views through from the likes of Second Sight, and I'm sure we'll probably come on to their reports in due course. It was more about my thoughts about going to court was more about how do you draw a line under it, because when you've got a very committed set of people in the form of the JFSA who are certain that there is a problem, and yet the investigations done by Post Office, Second Sight and others, and including things around like the Cartwright King review, etc., that's saying there isn't a problem, you'll never be able to meet in the middle. So the court, my views about the court were less about there being independent scrutiny. It was more about, if the court says what it says, then there's nowhere else for either party to go. It kind of arbitrates. And I always felt that I couldn't really arbitrate in my position.
Can I ask you to slow down a little bit in your answers?
Sorry.
Even though they're very long, the shorthand writer is struggling to take down each of the words that you say.
Okay.
Do you consider, standing back, that you showed undue deference to what Post Office was telling you?
I think on reflection, I think you probably do have to draw that conclusion. I would say, though, that the stuff that we got, the information we got through from Post Office was often quite comprehensive and full and analytical. So when I look at things like the response to the Panorama programme, the response to the debates that they put out in public as well, the response to the Second Sight Part 2 report, the slideshows, the 30-page slideshow they prepared for Baroness Neville Rolfe, for example, it was always quite comprehensive and analytical and I thought well thought through. So I may have shown too much deference, but what I perceived at the time was quite comprehensive answers coming my way. It wasn't a sort of one-line brush off.
You said earlier that you think that you, looking back, are guilty of a lack of curiosity.
Well, yes, I think it's self-evident that there's a lack of curiosity, because obviously there was a problem and I didn't get to it, so I accept that. But I think that there were times where, I think we were curious, clearly not curious enough, but as I say, that we were getting a lot of information from Post Office, and it was pretty comprehensive and analytical and looked well thought through. So you draw a degree of assurance from that.
Can I take you through some documents that may help us to understand the relationship between you and Post Office in the provision of information to outside sources? Can we start, please, by looking at poll 0010 0581? Thank you. If we look at the bottom of page 1, please, we'll see an email from Peter Batten. Thank you, to Belinda Crowe, copied to you. Peter Batten was a member of the shareholder executive, is that right?
Correct.
Was he somebody who reported to you?
Yes.
He emails you and Belinda Crowe on the 23rd of April 2014 and says, "Hi Belinda, thanks for your time. Please see attached 2 draft letters, one we're proposing to send to Alan Bates and one to Sir Anthony Hooper, on the assumption that the JFSA is unable to provide a reason for us to not forward the letter. We've included the final paragraph on the letter to Sir Anthony as a means of giving Jenny a future hook into the process. For example, in the event she feels she needs to intervene. I'd be grateful for your views on the benefit of including this hook versus the risk of perceived infringement on Sir Anthony's independence. And if we go to the top of the page, we can see that Miss Crowe of the Post Office replies, grateful if we could have a word about handling. I've also left you a message. Having had a good opportunity to look at the letter, I think it contains some very significant points which have to be addressed by both the Post Office and the chair of the working group. And so just on a point of sort of process or understanding how SheX works, is it right that it would be normal that SheX would run drafts of letters that it proposed to send out through the Post Office?
Not always, no. So it depends on very much depends on the context.
And so, looking at this exchange,
yeah.
Why was SheX saying, is it okay,
yeah.
essentially, if we say what we want to say?
Because we'd received a letter from Sir Alan Bates, I
yes.
think, on the 16th of April. Going back to my point in my witness statement about feeling the points of tension between intervening or not intervening, we were very aware that the mediation scheme was independent. We understood Sir Anthony Hooper to protect his independence very closely. So I think Sir Alan Bates's letter was, I think, encouraging us to intervene. We didn't want to intervene because we felt the mediation scheme should play out. And we wanted to tell Sir Anthony Hooper. The reason why we ask Belinda is because she was administering and leading the working group's operation and probably knew Anthony Hooper best. And so he wanted her view as to how he would receive the letter and how best to handle it with him.
Did you ever do things the other way round? Are you right to write a draft letter to Sir Alan or to Sir Anthony or any of the sub-postmasters and say, we're proposing to say this to the Post Office, is it okay if we say it?
No.
So the Post Office was the source of your information and vetted your letters?
No, we didn't vet the letters, but I think we were very sensitive about the mediation scheme because this is what... April 14. So, it's starting, well, it's definitely started to unwind in the sense that we've got this letter from Sir Alan Bates. But it feels to us the only way to really resolve a lot of the concerns. And everybody had agreed, I think, it's before my time, that government would just stay out of the mediation scheme to the extent possible. And so we saw Belinda as a sort of a route to test how the working group, in particular Sir Anthony Hooper, would want to deal with this situation.
Thank you. Can we look at some other examples? UKGI 402467. And look at the foot of the page, which is the start of the chain.
Yeah.
Melanie Caulfield sending within the Post Office a letter, a Sparrow letter, to Mark Davis, and then scrolling up. 9th of September, Mark Davis sending that letter to you. Here you go, let me know what else you need. Indeed, does this do enough for you? And then scroll up a little. You say, sorry, is there also an example of the inaccuracies, etc., I could use to illustrate the issue? Cheers and sigh. And he replies, report claims power loss can lead to data loss and thus real loss for sub-postmaster. Strongly refute that.
Yep.
So is the context here that, in fact, you tell us the context.
So I think the context is that the second site, the first draft of the second site Part 2 review is out. And I think we were providing advice to Joe Swinson. I think, we'd asked Post Office, I'm not sure whether we'd asked Post Office to provide a letter to Joe Swinson or whether they volunteered one, they would share a draft with me, essentially to check that it's intelligible and the like. And I think it said at the top of the letter, there are various inaccuracies in the letter. Sorry. The letter was saying that there was inaccuracies in Second Sight's report.
Yes.
And I thought, well, if I need to have an answer as to what an example of what those are, because Joe Swinson will ask. So can you give me an example to substantiate what you're saying, please, Mark?
And so why would you go to the head of media and communications for this kind of issue?
Well, because that team would write the letter, because it comes from Melanie Caulfield, who was one of his team. And
so this is about a draft letter from the Post Office to the Minister.
To the Minister. I think, yeah.
And you're intervening and saying it needs beefing up.
Well, they're writing to us to say this is what we're going to send, and they would often do that, and we would often ask to do that, because I think sometimes, going back to my role as interpreter, sometimes what they thought was clear wouldn't necessarily be clear to government, so they sort of sent it through. It was customary for them to send something like that to us, not always. To get my view on it, and where I'm saying there, your letter's not clear enough. Can you give an example, so that when Joe inevitably asks me, what does Post Office mean by inaccuracies in the report, I can say, well, what they mean is this. So it's trying to preempt the question, as it were, that I know I'm going to get from ministers, because their letter isn't sufficiently clear.
And so are you here performing the role of a Post Office NED in seeking to put the company's best case to the Minister?
No, I'd say that this is clearly there's a Venn diagram of it, but I'd say I'm the shareholder team here, looking what sort of communications the Post Office is sending to the Minister, and sort of giving them a few hints and tips that it might be beneficial if they could make it a bit clearer before it goes. Or I think probably what's going on here is that they've either possibly sent it already, and I'm trying to get ready to anticipate the questions I'm inevitably going to get from the Minister.
Can we move forwards, please, to December, UKGI 402726? This is an email from you to Belinda Crowe and Patrick Borg, forwarding a draft speech, I think, of the Minister in readiness for the WHD, the Westminster Hall debate, I think was to take place on the 17th of December 2014. And you say, thanks for your respective emails. I'll take a look and amend Joe's speech accordingly. But given that I'm about to get in a car for a couple of hours to drive back home, I thought it might be expedient to get this off to you now. To do a sweep of things we shouldn't say. I hope I haven't gone too far. The problem is, ideally, we wouldn't be having this debate. But as we are, Joe has to be able to say something reasonably concrete in response to the accusations. Thanks to you for your help. So you're asking them to vet the Minister's speech, is that right? To do a sweep of things we shouldn't say?
Yes, the context, I would say, though, is that, when it comes to parliamentary debates, there was always a close relationship between Post Office and the shareholder team, because the Post Office is at the operational forefront. So, to give a non-Sparrow example, a constituency matter around a closure approach, a debate around a closure of a particular constituency, Post Office, or redundancies in the supply chain, or industrial action, that kind of thing. Post Office can't speak to Parliament, it has to be the Minister. We would therefore verify things and share information and get information from the Post Office to be able to facilitate that debate. And I think what I'm saying there is, here's the speech. Is there anything in there that we are saying that is sort of either factually wrong, or whatever? So it wasn't be unusual.
So would you routinely seek advice from, or input from, the Post Office on letters to be sent by SHEX?
Well, this is well, this is about a speech.
Yes. I'm talking about
Letters.
looking at the run of things we've looked
Oh, I
at.
see. Right. So not necessarily. No. Most of the time, no. Our letters wouldn't be run past post office. Although that said, we would have standard stock responses for things like a post office closure.
Okay. Would
here.
you? I'm going to have to try and
Speed me up?
no, definitely not speed you up.
Sorry.
Ask you to try and constrain your answers more directly to the questions I'm
Fine.
asking.
I'm just sorry. Yeah, fair enough. I'm just saying it's not unusual. It was standard practice to share some things with post office. Usually there was standard text which we wouldn't have to share with post office because we already had a shared agreement as to what we were saying. On
debates,
on
like
debates, on debates, we would usually share that sort of text, and indeed they would come in and talk to the minister about the debate. It was very, very close because they're at the forefront of the operational side of things, which is generally speaking what the debates are concerned with.
What steps did you take, if any, to verify the lines given to you by post office?
I think it depends on the line. So we wouldn't just, if they made a change, we wouldn't just accept it. The lines and the speech would be our speech, but we're checking what whether they've got any views on it.
How would you seek to verify the lines that the post office was giving to the minister to take either in a speech or in correspondence?
Well, we wouldn't always verify it because it depends on what it was. If that's
On the occasions in which you did seek to verify it, how would you go about that?
I don't know, to be honest. I suppose a lot of it would be just probing and asking a sort of second level or third level question in response to what they've said to sort of try and understand the response. I mean, there'd be rarely sort of backing documentation to this sort of stuff. It would be a view where you'd be sort of asking, are you sure? Well, you say this, but how about that?
Can we move forward, please, to January 2015 and look at UKGI 402996? Now, if we scroll to the bottom of the page, please. An email from you to the Swinson MPST. Is that a generic email address
That's her
for
office.
Joe Swinson's office, private office, is it?
Yes, so it goes to sort of 4 or 5 people that are in her office.
You say Ailsa, who presumably is one of her private offices, is that right? Further to my updates on the Horizon scheme, note it looks as if the BizCom, BizCom are inviting sub-postmasters and post office to sessions on the 3rd of February. I suggest that Jo stays clear of this if she can, given that this is an independent scheme, but I suppose she might inevitably be drawn in. I haven't talked to post office about this yet, so we'll keep you posted. I'd be grateful if you could provide us with Jo's views following my email of yesterday, as clearly this may have handling implications for post office, although instinctively it feels that the more conciliatory we are on this, the more the JFSA get to try and widen the scope of the scheme to find a smoking gun which does not exist. And then you forward that further up the page to Laura Thompson. What role did she then perform?
She had just joined the team.
The SheX team.
Yeah, taking over from Peter Batten, who was the prior person looking after Horizon for me.
Saying that she better get up to speed on Horizon. So far, we've not been sucked in, but it's probably only a matter of time. And is that how you viewed matters at the time?
Well, you could feel the pressure building. We'd spent a year trying to keep this as an operational matter for Post Office. And the pressure was building that we might be required to intervene.
What did you mean by the suggestion that the JFSA were trying to find a smoking gun which does not exist?
Well, by that time, a lot of the mediation investigations had been done. We hadn't heard of any specific problem with Horizon that caused losses to sub-postmasters. And there was the Second Sight were expanding their scope of work, and I thought that might be because they hadn't found the issues they were expecting to find with the Horizon scheme, and therefore they'd be widening their scope because they hadn't found the smoking gun, which is the bug that creates the losses.
The words that you use appear to suggest, would you agree, that you had formed the view that there would be no smoking gun found in relation to problems with the Horizon system?
I think by that time I probably had, or at least on the balance of strongly on the balance of probabilities that's the view I'd taken.
And did that mindset pervade your thinking and affect your actions?
I think
not only has one not been found, one will not be found.
Yeah, because I think that's probably right. Over the course of time, another year had gone by of investigations, in particular investigations of people's cases that had said there is a problem, had been looked at by Post Office, looked at by Second Sight. We hadn't heard of a particular bug causing the loss. So my emerging conclusion was, yes, there isn't an issue, and it did colour my view going forward from around that point.
Why were you so sure that the smoking gun did not in fact exist?
Well, as I say, there'd been, I think by that point, almost 2.5 years of investigation, including by Second Sight, and they hadn't found, and they'd looked at...
Including by Second Sight, who had been the other investigation?
Well, by Post Office. So Post Office had looked, and right...
How had they looked?
Well, sorry.
Yes, what investigation had they conducted?
Oh, well, so as part of the mediation scheme, Post Office had a team of 20 people that would be looking at each individual case. That case was referred to Second Sight to also investigate. So you'd had two sets of investigations with the first...
And is that how you viewed it? There were two investigations going on here?
Yeah, that's how I viewed it. There were two investigations going on, one of which is independent, the latter one, Second Sight. I trusted the first one, the investigations done by Post Office.
Why were you so credulous when it came to reassurances from Post Office, and yet so disbelieving of what the sub-postmasters and the MPs were telling you?
Because I suppose it's from the point of view that I was looking for a bug in the Horizon system that created losses with a direct link. I thought that's what everybody was looking for, rightly or wrongly. That's what I was sort of looking for. And I hadn't...
Just stop there. Why were you looking for that?
Well, because that's what I thought the case was about. That there were, and it's often even said now in the media today, there are bugs in Horizon. I thought we were looking for bugs in Horizon that were unknown to Post Office, and that they were causing losses to the sub-postmasters. I was looking for a causation of finding an unknown bug that hadn't been previously known about that caused the loss at the sub-postmaster end. And by this stage here, in February 15, as I'd understood that sort of investigation had been going on in one form or another for 2 and a bit years, if 2.5. So over that time, that's what gave me, I wouldn't say confidence, but it gave me the feeling that there wasn't a smoking gun knocking around, and that's why, rather than the JFSA widening the scope, that's why I felt that Second Sight really were seeking to widen the scope, because they hadn't found any particular problems with the individual cases where they were saying there was an issue.
Can we turn to the issue of obtaining information from the Post Office and look at UKGI 402292? An email from you to Peter Batten of the 1st of May 2014.
Yep.
And if we just scroll down a little bit. Thank you. In the last paragraph, I'm going to skip over the substance if I may. You say, I hope I haven't crossed a line by saying Tim mentioned you're worried that I apportioned some blame to the team for the press notice stuff. So I think this part is about a press notice. I'm not sure exactly what it's about.
No,
you continue. I just want to be clear that I don't at all. It has, however, taught me a lesson. I need to push harder on Post Office to get things done. I've been too reliant on their promises to deliver, which has been an error on my part. However, we do, however, need to be realistic as well. Our view and their view will often be different.
Yep.
And we're going to have to pick our battles.
Yep.
What's the context of this? Can you remember?
I honestly can't remember. I think it's something to do with number one, about, because it's a press notice, Mark Davies, and I think Becky Barrow was a journalist of some description. But I honestly can't remember the...
You said that you had been too reliant on Post Office's promises to deliver.
Yeah.
Was, other than in this context, was that a theme of your work over the 4 years that we're looking at? Did you feel that you were over-reliant on them?
That I was over-reliant? Well, I was reliant on them. I don't think I was over-reliant on them. I mean, it depended on what the issue was. But in terms of comms, which I think this is about, it's about relying on them to do it the way that we felt appropriate. I think I can't really remember, I'm afraid.
Can we turn to poll 0015-8108, please? And look at page 3, please. And scroll down. And keep going. Yes, we can see that this is signed off by Neil Hayward, Group
Yes.
People Director. Do you remember the function that he performed?
He was, he was people director, like HR director.
And if we go up, please. And keep going. Thank you. Just a little bit further. I think we can see a little bit further from the reply. Keep going. And again. We can see from the reply here that I think Mr. Hayward's email went to, amongst others, Paula Reynolds.
Yes.
Okay, if we scroll back down to the beginning part of his email. Thank you. So February 14, for your information, I recently met with Richard, that's you, during his induction and mine to the post office. He provided me with some insight on the things that interest him. I thought I should share what I learned. Scroll down, please. The post office is hugely politically important, whilst it is probably the third biggest of the around 20 or so businesses being managed through SheEx. It carries the highest profile. Everything that we do has the potential to create issues for ministers. This is partly why they will always ask us detailed questions. He explained that the Treasury applies pressure to ensure the investment in the Post Office is doing what they said it would do. Would that record of what you are said to have said be accurate?
I can't really remember, but...
i.e. the content?
But yeah, that's probably something I might well have said.
And if we scroll up to page 1, please. Ms. Venel's reply. See the note below. She's forwarding this to Alice Perkins. And if we, just scroll down, please. The direct reply, if we just keep going. She says, Richard, that's you asked the right questions. And then in the next paragraph, Richard has the job of making sure that government gets a return. We're in the delivery phase, and within BIS, he is accountable. We need to make him comfortable and confident that we will deliver what we set out to. And then scroll on a little bit, please. 3 paras from the bottom there. Richard's scope has not yet picked up Sparrow or business transformation. It will, as he is attending next week's board meeting. But as this is the case, I suggest we leave them off the SheEx review agenda, as he will be well briefed by then. So looking at this exchange generally then, at the time that you joined Post Office as a NED and took over as the lead on the SHEX team, was it the case that Post Office carried the highest profile amongst all of the businesses managed by SHEX?
I think so, yes.
How did the political importance of the Post Office impact on the nature and extent of SHEX's and ministerial interest in Post Office?
Sorry, can you explain the question? Sorry.
Yes. How did the political importance of the Post Office, that is explained or described in this exchange here, impact on the nature and extent of SHEX involvement in or oversight of Post Office? Did it make it different from many of the other 19 businesses?
No, it's sort of a question of degree, but there was always interest politically, both from ministers, but because of interest in Parliament and the media around what Post Office was doing, whether it be its network transformation, whether it be putting Crown offices into WH Smith, anything and everything always seemed to create a lot of media attention and parliamentary attention, which just meant there was a lot of scrutiny.
Mr. Hayward said that you wanted to get underneath the surface a bit, you'll remember in that email.
Mm-hmm.
What did you do to get under the surface a bit?
Well,
in practical terms,
we were on the phone to Post Office and emailing Post Office practically every day about every different, those overwhelming number of issues. So anything from tearing apart their funding plan to understanding the latest difficulties they were having in particular issues. So it was a sort of just constant stream of areas that we would discuss with them, from industrial relations to closing the pension scheme to particular particular Post Office closures or changes. There was a mix of very macro and micro issues constantly coming our way that people were interested in. And we would go and ask them questions, we would go and visit them, we would get on the phone, we would send them emails, and we would try and get satisfied with what they are telling us.
Was there a document which told businesses, that document can come down, thank you, which told businesses which SHEX managed and oversaw what government expects of it?
I'm not sure there was. I mean, there are framework agreements and articles of association and those sorts of constitutional structures, and there are chairman's letters or letters to the chair and those sorts of things. So it depends on the company.
Can we look, please, at UKGI 304-4314? This is part of the SHEX handbook. Do you remember that?
Only vaguely. I remember it being written when I arrived in 2007.
Was it not a document which, being a handbook and everything, that people might have recourse to?
Not particularly, no. I don't recall it really being, after the first few months of it being in existence, it didn't really get, from memory, really get rolled out. I mean, when I saw it, I was like, oh, I remember what that was, but I don't recall particularly it being rolled out as something that everybody had as a handbook.
Was it, even when limitedly rolled out, something which businesses, which SHEX managed, were directed to or given a copy of?
I don't think so. I think it was internal. But I don't know for sure. It may well have been at the time.
Can we just look at page 3, please? This is in the section of corporate governance. And if we scroll down, please. So if we just go back to page 2, please. And then page 3. And scroll down. And over the page. Thank you. The heading, what government expects of its businesses.
Yeah.
In order for this to be effective, presumably the business would have had to have been given this.
I can see why you'd say that. I'm not sure if it ever was, and I think that would be more around the idea that the shareholder team would. This is what the shareholder team should expect of its business.
But don't tell the business about it.
I don't think you tell the business about it. No.
That seems slightly odd, if I may say, Mr. Callard.
Yes, but I think you're placing reliance on a single internal document that was done in 2007, which by 2014 things had moved on. I mean,
Was this updated then?
I don't know. I don't think it was. For example, it doesn't mention. I know it's on page 2. It doesn't mention, for example, having a shareholder net because time had moved on. So I think this. I don't know what happened to it. To be honest,
I've been looking for a document that emanated from government that would be passed to a business, telling the business what government expected of it in terms of general principles of governance. Yeah. And this is the closest I've been able to find. You say that this would have been an internal document, even though it set out expectations of businesses managed by SHEX and may not have been passed to them.
Well, I can't remember what happened to that document. Clearly time has moved on, but I think the stuff there, looking at it, is stuff that you would expect a business that you are the shareholder of to be doing anyway.
So businesses
should be honest, open. Sorry.
Should seek an honest, open, and ongoing dialogue with the government as shareholder. Should clearly communicate the plans they're pursuing, the likely financial and wider consequences of those plans. Principle 1. Principle 2, businesses should operate a no surprises policy, ensuring the government as shareholder is informed well in advance of anything potentially contentious in the public arena.
Yep.
And then principle 8, businesses should have and continue to develop coherent strategies for each business unit. The approach to reviewing strategy should be a dialogue between the board and the shareholder.
Yes.
You say that these are essentially, have I got you right, are so obvious that a business ought need to be told about them?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I was, this time when this came out, I was an assistant director. So I don't know quite what happened and why this sort of phased away. And I've no idea what happened to principles 3, 4, etc. But yes, I think you'd expect, and we would expect as a shareholder team, businesses to operate that. And that's kind of the culture that we would expect a business would have, and that we would operate on the understanding of.
And so when you joined in 2014, were you aware of any of the following, that the Post Office had known about a whole series of bugs, errors and defects in Horizon that had existed right from its inception since 2000?
No.
That included the Falkirk Square bug from 2006?
I think what I understood was the second site advice, which had mentioned two bugs.
One of which was Falkirk.
Right, okay. So
is that right?
I can't remember, I'm afraid. So I knew that there was the position I understood as I came into the role was that there was no systemic failures, given there's probably a discussion about what that really means. And then there were 2 known bugs, but as my understanding was that the losses caused by those bugs had been corrected by Post Office, so the sub-postmasters didn't lose out. So that was my understanding of the extent of bugs.
Were you ever told that the Post Office was in possession of expert reports as a result of civil litigation that it had engaged in 2004 and 2006, which challenged the proposition that Horizon was robust?
No.
But were you ever told about the previous acquittals of sub-postmasters, each of whom had raised the defective operation of Horizon as part of their defence? The names included Susan Palmer, Maureen McKelvey and Nicola Arch.
No.
Would you expect to be briefed about that kind of thing?
Yes.
By whom?
anybody that was talking to me about Sparrow.
And they were issues that were relevant to, or they were matters that were relevant to issues in the group litigation.
Right.
Would you agree?
Well, they are. Yes, they're certainly relevant.
Whether Horizon was robust and whether sub-postmasters have been liable under their contracts for alleged shortfalls. To whom do you attribute responsibility for the government not being informed of such matters?
That's hard to say because those matters are quite historical. So I don't know who would be, I mean, whether it be the legal team that should have that on file and should tell people about it.
Was SheEx ever made aware of the Simon Clarke advice in relation to the credibility of the Post Office's main expert witness, Gareth Jenkins?
No, the first time I learned about the Clarke advice was in the sort of fallout of the GLO, I think.
Sorry, you learned about it in the context of the GLO?
Yes, when it got raised in the GLO, there was advice, the Clarke advice. Was.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Oh, well, it was just, I think...
Because as far as we know, the outward-facing disclosure of the Clarke advice didn't occur until November 2020 in the context of the criminal appeals.
Okay, so maybe when I say GLO, I mean the legal cases that happened after me. Sorry, I don't mean specific. Well, I don't understand the nuances between the different cases, but as part of the findings against Post Office, I heard about the Clarke advice. Well, that's the first time I'd heard about it.
You've seen it now?
It was in my bundle.
Yes. Is that the kind of, in the light of the questions that you were asking and the things that the Post Office was saying publicly, is that the kind of document that you would expect to have been provided with, or the content summarised to you?
Yes, and I would expect the board to have been provided, before I got there, the board to have been provided with it immediately, given the board then was looking at prosecutions and the safety thereof.
Of course, the duties set out here, or the expectations set out here, cut both ways, don't they? There was a duty on SheEx to exercise a degree of professional curiosity and scrutiny, is that right?
Yes.
You said that you accept personally that on reflection you were insufficiently curious.
Yes, I think that's self-evident because I didn't get to the bottom of it.
Is that the basis on which you say you were insufficiently curious? I.e. that in fact there were things that you did not discover? Or is it a more nuanced reflection on what you in fact did or didn't do?
Well, I think that it's probably both. I mean, clearly I'm one part of this, but it's difficult to know what to ask for if you don't know about it. So you can't go and ask, well, is there any evidence that you've got that prosecutions aren't safe, when it's been presented to board before you've got there that prosecutions are safe, and that was set out by an independent firm and a KC. You have to take assurance from the independent advice that's been given to a board before you get.
When you were first appointed as shareholder net, what was your understanding of Post Office's investigatory and prosecutorial functions?
There had been quite a comprehensive discussion in the February board about the new prosecution policy, and that paper contained a reasonable amount of detail about the history, in addition to the forward look about the new policy. So I was aware quite early on that Post Office brought prosecution. I don't think I understood the nuances of that, of being prosecutor, victim, investigator.
In your witness statement, you say that, for the note, it's paragraphs 273 and 329, that you understood that there had been a review in 2013 by Cartwright King and Brian Altman, QC, which had been reassuring, and the comfort I took from what I understood to be a thorough review by Cartwright King and Brian Altman, QC, was clearly misplaced. I had never heard directly from any of the affected sub-postmasters on the issue of past prosecutions, and you say that you weren't and the board was not provided with a copy of Mr. Clark's advice of the 15th of July 2013. At the time that you were told about the Cartwright-King review, did you understand that to an extent it was marking its own homework, i.e. reviewing prosecutions which it itself had brought?
I don't think that occurred to me. I mean, I learnt of it in the first board that I observed. I wasn't a member, and I was still getting to grips with all of the things of Post Office, so that I wouldn't have thought too deeply about that paper.
And so is the comfort that you took hearing the words that a firm of solicitors and a QC have undertaken a review and the outcome of it was reassuring?
Well,
is that as far as it went?
Well, I took comfort from the board. I mean, the board that I joined had that advice, was broadly comfortable with it, and whenever, you know, the focus of the board thereafter tended to be around the mediation scheme, not past prosecutions. So I didn't just take comfort from the paper that I read. I took comfort from the fact that the rest of the board, it didn't seem to be an issue that the rest of the board were vexed about, so I took my lead from that one.
Did you ever receive any copies of legal advice that Post Office obtained during your time, either as shareholder Ned or as SheEx?
I can't remember. I may have done, but I can't think of any instances.
So you can't recall any instances where you actually read the advice rather than what Post Office said was in the advice?
I can't think of any instances. Not saying there weren't any, but...
Did you ever request any copies of the primary material itself, i.e. what the actual lawyer actually said?
Well, I can't think of an instance that, outside of the Sparrow situation, where there was legal advice to... Hold on, let me... Sorry, wait a minute. I may have seen some in relation to the reprocurement of Fujitsu. I guess the Linklaters advice of March 15 is legally privileged. I mean, so yes, I will have seen some.
Was there a prohibition, to your understanding, on board members seeing the legal advice itself?
Not that I understood, but I've since seen evidence from others, such as Tim Parker, where that has happened. I didn't understand there to be a prohibition.
Was that ever the subject of discussion, i.e. board members saying, we actually want to see what is said by our legal advisor, rather than what somebody says the legal advisor has said?
I don't recall that ever being discussed.
Thank you. So it's just after 5 past. I wonder whether we can take our first morning break until 20 past, please.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much, sir. Good morning, sir. Can you continue to see and hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Callard, can you move right forward and aim both microphones at your mouth, please? I've been told that those listening online have sometimes encountered difficulty in hearing you.
Right.
Thank you. Is it right that one of the key roles of SheEx was to identify risks in relation to each of its assets?
Yes.
And is it right that SheEx maintained a monthly risk register?
For each asset, yes.
Is it right that the completion of that risk register on a monthly basis didn't simply entail recording the business's own assessment of risk, but was in fact SheEx's own assessment of the risk?
That's right.
As the person who led the Post Office shareholder team, was it ultimately your responsibility to ensure that the risks were A, properly recorded,
Yes.
and B, adequately assessed?
Yes.
But was it therefore your responsibility to ensure that you and your team had sufficient information in order properly to record and to assess risk?
Yes.
Can we look at some examples across the years, please? Starting with 2014 by looking at UKGI 402515. This is the risk register for the 13th of February 2014. And so just for some context, that is 7 or 8 months after the publication of the Second Sight interim report. And as we now know, at a time when the Post Office was aware of problems connected with Mr. Jenkins' evidence in criminal prosecutions, and at a time when advice was being sought externally from the likes of Cartwright King and Brian Altman, KC.
Yeah, could you just scroll down? I was looking at this last night. So,
To which line?
Well, where you are now, I'm not sure whether because the date should be in the top right-hand corner where it says TBC.
If we go to title and guide, so bottom left.
Yeah, it's just the reason why I'm saying that is because the person that's got one of the risks around the Post Office card account is Leonie Lambert, who joined the team at the end of 2014.
So what's the point that you're making?
Because you're saying that it's at February 14, and I'm saying it's probably 8 months beyond February 14.
So this is a document that UKGI sent us,
Yep.
and it's got on it, can you see last updated 13th of February 2014? Can you see that? Third box down, last updated.
Yeah, yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Are you saying that's wrong?
I'm saying I'm not sure, but I know that there was a different person. If we're dealing with February 14, there was a different person in charge of some of those risks at the time, so I'm not entirely sure of the date. The risks, though, broadly are probably similar to what they were in February 14.
So if we go back to risk register.
Yeah.
Thank you. And can you point to the person?
So government digital transformation, that was Leonie Lambert, and the Post Office card account, risk 6, Leonie Lambert, she joined the team, I think, towards the back end of 2014. It was prior to that Katrina Ledbetter that would have looked after those things. She was there as the government services person when I joined the team.
So what does that mean for us then? Hold on.
Sorry.
We shouldn't rely on the dates on the UKGI risk registers as being true.
To be honest, I don't know actually what it means. All I was saying was because you were putting it in the context of it's February and it's X number of months after Second Sight. I'm saying it's not. I think it's actually perhaps a little bit beyond that. So that's all I'm saying. In case you were
I'm not challenging you. I'm seeking to understand what we should, what reliance this inquiry can place on UKGI's documents. And if we look, for example, at line 7, we scroll down.
Yeah.
There's an entry there with, and the third part of column B, just one to the left, if you put the cursor one to the left, that's it. Can you see it says 13th of February 2014, terminated 1st of October 2014, which tend to support the point that you're making.
Yes.
So how should we treat these documents?
I don't know. I can only imagine that 13th of the 2nd in each of those is the date that the risk was created.
Going back to title and guide on page 1.
Yes, I noticed. Yeah, I get that.
That says last updated.
I know.
Because obviously the risks change sometimes.
Yes, I get that entirely. But I'm just pointing out that what date that document comes from. I think last updated. I don't recall us ever really updating the first page, because the interesting bits are on the second page.
So where it says last updated, you don't recall that ever being updated?
No, I don't recall that ever being. In fact, I'm not sure whether they even come round with that title and guide page on anymore. They just come round as the risk register tab.
So going back to the risk register then, please.
Yep. Sorry if I'm causing some confusion.
No, it's not. No, it's just the extent to which we can place reliance on documents that are given to us.
Yep.
We shouldn't treat this as a document which accurately records the risks as the SHEEX saw them on the 13th of February 2014. Some of the text may have been inserted after that date.
And the ratings may have moved around a bit.
Given that this was done on a monthly basis,
Yep.
if we look for the March one,
Yep.
oughtn't that to be the place to update it rather than updating the February one?
Well, this is probably this is, I would imagine, it has been updated in March and April and February and until we get to October, and then this is the October view, as it turns out.
I see. So we should search through the document and look for the latest date that there's an entry on it, and we could say confidently that it has been amended at least at that time.
I've seen plenty of risk registers that are in my bundle which have the top right date put on them.
Yeah.
And that's what should have happened. I don't know why it happened. I mean, these risk registers came in around about February, which is why all those entries are created then, I think. And so people were still getting used to populating them and possibly didn't populate the top right-hand.
Was the purpose of the risk register to act as a tool to provide a snapshot of known risks, to provide a tool to ensure prompt oversight and discussion of risk management on an ongoing basis, and then to provoke action as a result?
Yes, it provided an opportunity for the team to think about risk and to communicate risk sort of into the centre of checks.
Is that right? An opportunity to consider risk and to communicate what the risk was rather than do anything about it?
Well, inherently, we were doing stuff about all of these risks. I mean, we wouldn't write risk down and then not deal with it, or not take steps to deal with it.
And so the act of assessing and then recording the risk was a tool to ensure action was then taken?
Yes, because what you would tend to do on these sorts of risk registers, the risks would stay the same. The mitigations would move about a little bit, but generally speaking, the main change would be in the far right-hand column of current status, which is essentially saying this is the latest, and it would either set out what we've done or what is happening.
Can we look at lines 55 to 57, please? Thank you. And risk number 11, which is Project Sparrow. Mr. Batten's name underneath it, is that the lead on the risk or the owner of the risk?
He's the person leading the work on it. So if there was ever a Sparrow issue, I would turn to him and ask him to do the work. In the same way, if it was about the mails contract above, I'd ask him to do that.
If we look under Sparrow, it's quite difficult to read because the words page 2 are printed over the top of it, but just reading along all of lines 55 to 57, so the entirety of the risk numbered 11, there doesn't appear to be anything that addresses that one of the risks that had arisen was that Post Office may have prosecuted individuals wrongly on the basis of data which lacked integrity, does there?
No, that's right, it doesn't.
And if we look at the fourth column along, so I'm sorry, the fourth one with writing in it, so that, thank you, which I think is column K. I'm so sorry, I mean column F. Thank you, that's the one. Can you see that the type of risk is recorded?
Yes.
And it's recorded as being a reputational risk, a finance risk, and a people risk. It doesn't record the existence of a legal risk. Do you know why that would be?
I don't. Is legal an option?
Well, I don't know.
Well, the drop-down box would tell you.
Well, ought it to be an option?
Well, if that was, I suppose so, yes.
And
Although, sorry,
yes,
the risk register would often be about the risk to SHECs as much as the risk to the...
well, I was going to come to that question ultimately
it would come
in
something
a moment.
Sometimes get conflated.
But you might as well address it now, as you've mentioned it. Which organisation did the risks recorded on this document relate to?
The risks should relate to SHECs. What would often, and UKGI, what would often happen is that inherently the risk to the organisation would sort of creep in and it would get conflated, because if something at the organisation goes wrong, then essentially SHECs has to deal with the fallout of that. So in this case, it might have reputational risks for both Post Office, but also largely for SHECs in terms of having to deal with the issues that are involved with it.
And if you just look at the next column along, sort of G, H, I, and J, which is the RAG rating boxes, can you see those?
Yeah.
The probability of the risk eventuating, the impact of the risk if it does happen, and therefore the rating of the risk. Can you see that this risk rating rates Project Sparrow overall as having a risk rating of 9, which I think is the lowest or one of the lowest risks identified in this document?
I can see that it's a 9, yes.
Did that reflect the contemporaneous assessment of the risk to both SHEX and to the Post Office, that Project Sparrow was low risk?
I think that it reflects, yes, where we got to in terms of our thoughts around the investigations that had happened by that point, but it's also put in it's relative to other risks which we perceive to be higher. So, for example, 10 above it is perceived to be very high because there were existential threats perceived to Post Office in its relationship with Royal Mail, which was very reliant on.
I think what's supposed to happen is each numbered risk is then meant to be translated into a box or a circle that appears on the heat map. Is that right?
I think at that stage we used to summarise the top 6. So you'd only put the top 6 circles on.
I was about to say, is that why Project Sparrow doesn't even make it onto the heat map?
Yes, because there's 6 other risks perceived to be higher.
So risk 11 doesn't make it onto our heat map at the top there?
That's correct.
And would you agree there appears to be no mention, either in the text or otherwise, of the possibility that the Post Office may have prosecuted individuals and those prosecutions may have resulted in unsafe convictions?
Yeah, well, on reflection, yes, that should have been...
And there's no risk mentioned that Horizon might lack data integrity, which could undermine the functioning of the business, is there?
No, and I think that's... Well, I can speculate why that is, but no, I agree.
And in fact, Sparrow's perceived not to pose any legal risk to the Post Office or SHEX. Such risk as it does pose is reputational, financial and people. And in column E, the risk recorded is reputational and brand risk due to a perception. Is that how things were seen?
Well, because it's that the impact of risk is talking about the risk of the working group failing.
Do you think the things that I've mentioned count as omissions?
On reflection, knowing what I know now, yes, I would agree.
And do those omissions reflect a rather cursory and limited nature of the assessment of risk being undertaken?
I don't know. I disagree with that.
the Post Office had focused significant attention on Horizon issues during the work of Second Sight, hadn't it?
It's what? Sorry, say that
The
again.
Post Office had focused significant attention
On the work.
on Horizon in the course of the work of Second Sight.
That's correct.
And at this time was still undergoing a review of past criminal convictions. As I've said, it had taken advice and was taking advice from Brian Altman and Cartwright King.
I had understood that they were over by then, I think.
I see. So do you think that's why they're not mentioned?
So I think on entering the business in roundabout February, from my perspective, there has been a review by Second Sight with an interim report that says there's no systemic failures in Horizon. Stemming from that, the business has responded with a business improvement program, a review of...
Just stopping there. You framed the Second Sight interim report of the 8th of July as a report which said there are no systemic problems in Horizon.
Yeah.
Is that how you saw it?
I saw the position that I felt that I inherited was that there'd been a report that said there was no systemic failures within Horizon, but the business's response to that, nevertheless, was to review the safety of prosecutions, Cartwright King, to set up a business improvement program to deal with some of the issues around training, and also to set up a mediation scheme to investigate the individual cases that postmasters still had with Horizon. But by certainly this time, if this is around about October of 14, there had been quite a lot of investigation by Second Sight and by Post Office into the safety and integrity of Horizon. And therefore, as I said before, I hadn't seen any evidence that directly linked bugs, new bugs, any bugs apart from in Horizon to losses that hadn't been compensated for.
I see. So the fact that the possibility that the Post Office may have wrongfully prosecuted individuals, or that Horizon lacked data integrity, was such a remote possibility that it needn't even be recorded on a risk register.
I think that's probably right. We felt that the bigger risk was the blue blobs that are there. Plus, in terms of Project Sparrow specifically, we were looking for Post Office to sort this out via the mediation scheme, and the mediation scheme was not going very well, and that felt to be the bigger risk. The other risks that you've just cited there were felt to have been, wrongly, as it turns out, felt to have been dealt with, which is why there'd be a very low probability, and so probably not on that.
Sorry to interrupt, but item 11 is the identification of a topic which might give rise to a risk. All right, is that a fair way of starting that?
Yes. So you identify a risk.
So what, in terms of this risk register, do you understand Project Sparrow to be?
I understand it to be essentially the progress of the mediation scheme to bring resolution to both sub-postmasters and Post Office in the remaining 136, well not remaining, but the 136 cases where sub-postmasters came forward and had an issue with the working of Horizon.
Right. So if we understand Project Sparrow in the what I would call for these purposes the narrow sense of the mediation scheme, to my way of thinking at least, what follows kind of makes sense because you're assessing the risks associated with that scheme. What's lacking, I think, from this register, it might be argued, is any recognition of any kind, of any other potential risk arising from the use of Horizon.
Yeah, and I would agree with you, and the reason for that is because we thought that of the things we were seeing, either the risk was so small it didn't really warrant a either wasn't there or it didn't warrant an entry because the probability of it occurring was below 1 out of 5.
Yeah,
So
effectively, you're telling me that the wider risks which are being put to you by Mr. Beer, in your mind or in SHEX's mind or UKGI's mind, actually didn't qualify as a risk sufficiently important to put on this register.
I think that's right, given what we knew at the time and what
I follow that.
Yeah.
But that's your reasoning.
Yes,
but
yes.
I just wanted to understand in my head.
No, that's I think
This
fair
is all about. And have I got it right?
Yes, I think so. Yes. So we were very much focused on the mediation scheme and trying to get that to be successful and for Post Office to make sure that it runs.
Can we move forwards, please, a year to February 2015, UKGI 403427. And if we can just go to the guidance, please, the guidance tab.
It's different.
Yes, it's changed in nature. If we go back to the risk register.
The top right-hand date is now correct.
February 15, 28th of February 15. On this occasion, should we treat that as being a true date?
Yeah, I think we probably should.
And if we go, so just to put this in context, 28th of February 15, this was a couple of weeks after Paula Venables and Angela van der Bogaard had appeared before Parliament, the Select Committee, on the 3rd of February 2015. And I think also by this time the relationship between Second Sight and Post Office had deteriorated still further. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair.
And if we go to, thank you, we're there, 55 to 57, Project Sparrow described in the same way. Owner has changed. Should we understand, following the chairman's questions, the reference to Project Sparrow in the same way as you described it in relation to the previous spreadsheet, namely in the narrow sense of referring to the conduct of the work arising from Second Sight's interim report and the operation of the working group?
No, I think the Sparrow, as you've seen me use today, became a sort of catch-all term for anything to do with Horizon. So I would imagine that might have the term Sparrow might have widened out. It wasn't specifically focused on the mediation, but that probably was our focus still at the time.
So, do we understand the identity of the risk differently in the use of the words Project Sparrow on this spreadsheet?
I think it's an evolution of where we were from the prior spreadsheet. So
does this refer Project Sparrow now to wider issues, the bigger issues, as the chairman described them?
Yes, in the context of having a mediation scheme which is clearly not working very well, and a situation where there is more pressure on Post Office and the government because of that fact.
We'll see that the risk rating in columns G, H, I and J has not changed at all.
Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yeah, I can.
And again, I think it doesn't even make it onto the heat map.
No.
Had the risk therefore really remained unchanged since February 2014 or October 2014?
We're clearly saying that it has stayed the same. I think by the time I arrived in and got to grips with Sparrow in February and March, it was already the case that the mediation scheme was in trouble, and so I would imagine my perception of risk hadn't really changed between those periods of time, even though the the circumstances possibly had.
If we look at the final column, column Q, JFSA are increasing the profile of this issue, including them and Post Office going to BizCom in February. We've managed to keep ministers' distance from this for the moment, but we are seeing increased correspondence in this area. Risk level remains the same for now, given ministerial distance. Who had managed to keep ministers' distance from the horizon issues at the Post Office?
Well, by distant, I think what we mean is it's an operational matter for Post Office. And
so in the arm's length sense,
the arms
have got longer?
Well, the arms had stayed the same length, I would say.
I mean, I think over time you'll see sometimes the arms get longer when it suits government and then get shorter when it doesn't.
I'm not sure. Well, you see ministers wanting to check to do that, and often our advice, we know it's an arms. It is an operational matter for the business. They're the best place to deal with it, in our view, rightly or wrongly, and that was the advice we gave.
So, who had managed to keep ministers distanced?
Well, I suppose it's a combination of factors, but yes, it's our team in the sense that.
How had they managed to?
Well, in the sense that where there was inbound correspondence, we would say, well, that's a matter for Post Office, and we would ask Post Office to deal with it.
So you would roll out the it's an arm's length, an LB situation. It's an operational matter.
Well, yes, because we felt that it was an operational matter. We had obviously been involved a bit more. There'd been a debate, I think, in December 14 with Joe Swinson, so they had been involved a little bit more. But generally speaking, our position was still that it was an operational matter for the business, and that was the best place to sort it out.
If there was limited risk and the risk remained unchanged, why was there a need to keep the issue away from ministers?
Well, because the position of that I inherited hadn't changed in that sense. There was still it was an operational matter for the business. There was lots of stakeholder correspondence and parliamentary activity about it, but in essence, it wasn't all that different to the position I'd started with.
And that last column tends to suggest that a function or a primary function of this risk register is about the risk that the Post Office posed to government, rather than the risk that the Post Office posed either to itself or to the public.
Well, there's perhaps an element of that, because I said it's a checks risk register rather than a Post Office risk register. But we're always mindful. My job as a civil servant, with my civil servant hat on, is to try and deal with and protect ministers from undue, or even due sometimes, criticism. This was an operational matter for the business. That was the position that was established with ministers even before I joined, and that was what I was trying to do.
Was thought ever given to maintaining a risk register that recorded the risks that the Post Office posed to itself or to the public?
No, because we'd see that as being a thing for the Post Office to do.
Did you ever ask to see Post Office risk registers?
Not specifically, but I think they would have been come out as part of the board pack. When I joined the ARC, I would have seen them, but I would take assurance that the ARC that I didn't sit on initially would be dealing with that side of things.
Can we move forwards, please, to 2016 UKGI 406622? This top right is 29th of February 2016, so a year further on. And if we look, please, at lines 40 to 42. Thank you. We can see Project Sparrow.
Yeah.
If we go across the columns G to J, we can see that the risk has increased very substantially, both in terms of probability and impact, to a risk rating of 20. and highlighted in red under column K, responsibility rests with Post Office to manage both the mediation scheme and the stakeholders generally. Post Office Chair undertaking review with independent QC. That's a reference to the Parker or Swift review. We are managing ministers' involvement with the intention of keeping the issue independent of government. And then far right column in Q. Thank you. Post Office Chair. I wonder if that could just be expanded slightly. It's up at the top, thank you. Wrote to Baroness Neville Rolfe with an update on his review, meeting scheduled for end of April. Baroness Neville Rolfe keen to update Lord Arbuthnot, so need a public line. CCRC conclusion is not imminent, and no news about JFSA plans for class action. All mediations now completed. CEDA due to issue final summary shortly. This records that the intention was to keep the issue independent of government. Was that your understanding of SHEEX's, your intention at the time?
Yes, and we, when the new government came in May 15, we tested their position about whether it's an operational matter with ministers, to which they agreed.
And so it was understood that the chairman, Tim Parker, was undertaking a review with an independent QC. The CCRC's conclusion was imminent and mediations were completed. Mm-hmm. In those circumstances, what had happened to increase the risk assessment?
Well, the mediation had now completed, but there was still significant stakeholder issues. It hadn't put the matter to bed, and the mediation scheme clearly didn't offer a way through.
So in what sense did that increase the risk to SHEEX?
I suppose we'd hoped that the mediation scheme would put the matter to bed and it would be resolved. It clearly wasn't. We had a minister who was very interested in the topic, and we had to find a way to provide reassurance and continue to look at the issues to understand why those issues that JFSA was saying still existed, because it hadn't been dealt with by the mediation scheme, so there was a high risk.
Under column P, and if we just scroll up to the top, we'll see that that is an additional column for mitigating actions. Back down, please. It's recorded that further mitigating actions are to ensure that the Post Office is proactively managing interest and noise and is aware of ministers' expectations, manage interest and wobbles from ministers or the centre, including preparing fallback options if current arm's length position becomes untenable. There's quite a lot in there.
Yeah.
Firstly, what is meant in your mind by the word noise in this context?
I think it's shorthand for anything that is, inbound correspondence, parliamentary questions, potential debates, select committees.
Does it indicate things without substance?
No, it just is a shorthand word of saying, well, I suppose it means criticism. It means that everything that was going on at the time, it's a very shorthand word, and I think it's one of those words that people in government would understand and would use.
Manage interest and wobbles from ministers or the centre. Were those emerging?
Well, the Baroness Neville Rolfe was very keen to, was very interested in the topic, and
that's slightly different from a wobble.
It is, but it was about whether she felt comfortable or not with what was taking place. So periodically I think she did, and periodically I think she didn't. So at the time I think she'd commissioned Parker. She was sort of happy with that approach. We were waiting for Mr. Parker's review. But then, there was lots of noise, and she would respond to that, and there's a temptation for her to want to get more involved. And of course, our position, as we agreed with ministers, was that it was an operational matter for Post Office.
But a fallback was to be prepared if the current arm's length position became untenable.
Yes, I'm not.
So that indicates, does it not, Mr. Callard, that it's a matter of choice for government whether an arm's length relationship was maintained with the Post Office or not?
Yes, just.
And so the length of the arms can vary according to government's desire?
They can.
And why was it now being contemplated that the arms might get shorter?
Well, I think due to the passage of time, and no one has been satisfied, nobody from the JFSA has been satisfied with the results so far. I think we're waiting for, well, this implies we've already got Mr. Parker's letter, but anyway, the position's just sort of still evolving, I suppose.
Can we move forward to 2017, please? UKGI 407578. This is January 2017. Mm-hmm. Just click on the guidance, please. The guidance tab. Thank you. Yep. So back to risk register, please. And if we go to lines 85 to 87. Thank you. Under column D, civil litigation and or court of appeal processes, judge that Post Office has acted inappropriately or illegally, even absent such a finding, ongoing risk that they continue to be perceived to have acted in that way. E, potential for significant compensation claims if civil or criminal courts rule against Post Office. More likely, however, and certainly in the short term, is that this continues to be a significant distraction and cost to the business as they defend their actions. The risk has seemingly now dropped back down to 12.
Yep.
Column K, Post Office have external legal advisors employed on the civil litigation, including a QC. They continue to update UKGI through the board and directly on key stages, but this is a legal matter and distinct from government. And then UKGI have briefed Minister Margot James and will keep ministers and SPADs updated at this point. Bayes Legal are also up to speed and contributing to any advice to ministers, maintaining a position that the government will not comment on an ongoing legal issue. And then there's some detail as to court hearings. No timeline yet on when the CCRC review will be complete. So I think this now recognises, we can see from column F that there is a legal risk to presumably both the Post Office and SHEEX.
Yes.
But the risk...
Well, I'm not sure the risk is legal to SHEEX,
right,
but the risk itself is legal in nature.
Okay, so this column, who does it... who are the words relating to?
Well, this is it. It tends to get conflated, as I've said in my witness statement, as to exactly who the risk pertains to. But the nature of the risk itself is legal, and it's reputational, and it's financial.
The risk has reduced from 20 back down to 12. Mm-hmm. Why was that? Given litigation was afoot.
I think in part goes to whose risk it is, and I think government's position is that it is a matter for Post Office. And it's somewhat, actually, I think as a team lead, I felt it's slightly more out of my hands then, because it's a court process, and I always thought that court was where this was supposed to be. So I perceived the risk to be lower for the team, and therefore for SHEEX, because there was a separate process, which I would hope brings resolution. And it also led to less public correspondence and debate because it was with the courts. So everything had died down a bit.
How much reliance, Mr. Callard, should we really place on these risk registers, given that the words Project Sparrow can refer to different things, and that depending on, it seems, the attitude of the person writing the documents, the risk can relate to either the post office or to SHEX, or a bit of both, but it doesn't say.
Yeah. Well, I think these things are a guide to make the team think, to inform people who are reviewing the team, and to feed up to the centre. So I'm not sure how much reliance you can place on an internal risk register. This is just a kind of to get a snapshot at the time of how the team is feeling about the variety of risks that are with it.
I mean, there's no, for example, record of the fact that SWIFT had reported there were 8 recommendations and the extent to which those recommendations had been implemented.
Well, I hadn't seen SWIFT at that point, and I was unaware of SWIFT's findings.
So that's why it's missing.
Well, I've got a letter from Tim Parker, which I'm not sure if we're going to come to, but the letter, I feel, was different to the SWIFT report.
Very much so.
So I'm relying on the letter here, which is why I suppose the context is also with litigation. I thought the Parker letter essentially informs my stance on litigation, because I think Post Office is in perhaps a better position than it actually is, which might explain why the risk has gone down, because we've done Parker. Parker is essentially, well, not done, but it's given us some assurance, and I think we are approaching litigation in a relatively stronger position than, of course, Post Office was.
It records that Bayes Legal were involved and up to speed.
Yeah.
What were they up to speed with?
So when the Freeths litigation was launched, we wrote to, we emailed Bayes Legal to notify them. I think, I haven't got my timeline with me, but we had meetings with them. They were aware that it was going on. We introduced them to Post Office, and they met Post Office, I think, at our offices. And so they were patched in, and they were generally copied into any submissions and updates that we did. So they were aware of what was going on.
Did they review any of the legal advice that was given to the Post Office?
I don't think so, no.
Thank you. Can we move forward lastly then to 2018? And before we look at that, you tell us in paragraph 325 of your witness statement that by the time of your departure from the board in March 2018, you expected the GLO claim to fail.
Yep.
And you expected that the outcome of the litigation would be an endorsement of the integrity of the Horizon system, correct?
Yes.
Can we look, please, at UKGI 407995? Scroll to the top. We can see this is 10th of April 2018. So around the time of your handover to Mr. Cooper, would that be right?
He would have been in place for about 3 months by then. It was sort of parallel running, but yes.
Yes. So it was in the course of parallel working and therefore
Yes. Yep.
handover to him. And can we see on the heat map that the top rated risk, I think, is risk 12?
Yeah.
And if we go to risk 12, please. It's Project Sparrow under your name.
Mm-hmm.
Had you taken over responsibility for this risk?
I think, so Laura had gone and we were waiting for a new colleague to come in and take over from her. So the reason why it's in red is because that's a change. So it's new text compared to the previous risk register. So I was probably between team members.
We can see columns D and E are essentially the same as previously in the previous year. Can you see that?
Yes.
We can see in columns F to J that the legal risk in terms of and reputational risk are 4 and 5, albeit the score hasn't been uprated to presumably 20. Can you see that?
Yes, so it's you have to widen the column, but then it'd be a 20, yes.
Oh, it is. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I take it that the rating is simply 4 times 5.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there any magic about that?
No. It's just you can't.
It
It's
is-
just you can't. The column and the spreadsheet in this particular instance is not wide enough to put 20.0. If you widen the column, you'll see it.
No, not that. I mean, in terms of achieving a rating, is it sort of commonplace just to multiply
Yes.
the probability with the impact?
I think so. I've seen other risk registers like that. Yes.
Right. All right. Yeah. Fine.
K, essentially the same, but UKGI seeking to put a protocol in place to ensure permanent secretary remains up to date. Column P, UKGI have briefed minister and will keep ministers and SPADs updated at key points. Bayes Legal are up to speed, etc. And then lastly, Post Office are preparing for a security of costs hearing, which may trigger negative press. Post Office preparing, but which could lead to the case being dropped. Post Office preparing for the first main hearing in November. UKGI is citing Permanent Secretary Bayes on the issue and establishing disclosure protocol, etc. So now Project Sparrow is the top rated risk within the whole of SheEx, yes?
If you say so. But not for the whole of SheEx, but the whole
Yes,
Post Office team.
for the Post Office
yes.
team.
If if you tell me, if you say so, because I can't see the rest of the scores, but yes, I'll take your word for it.
And so it's the top rated risk with
Yep.
the highest probable impact
Yep.
rating, yes?
Yes.
Even with all of the mitigations listed.
Yep.
How was that so, given that you say that you were confident that you expected the claim to fail and the outcome of the litigation would be a full endorsement of the integrity of the Horizon system?
So I think it was due to the fact that we were having problems around the information protocol, sharing protocol. So I think it's possibly, I mean, I haven't seen how this risk has evolved between the last risk strategy you showed me and this one. But I think it's partly two things. One, difficulty with the information sharing protocol by that point, because we were still waiting to get that agreed with Post Office. And I think secondly, there's perhaps just a little bit of suddenly, for 2 years, it's been all very procedural and not much happening. And suddenly, I think there's an email in my pack somewhere where I say to people, well, actually, it's just getting closer, and this is why we're sort of focusing more on it. So it's much more in our mind. It's much more serious now than 18 months ago when there was lots of procedural hearings, or not even procedural hearings, but procedural discussion.
But you thought the claim was going to be roundly dismissed and integrity of Horizon upheld.
That's what yes.
But now this seems to have switched back to be looking at a different issue, namely the information management protocol and the risk that that created. Mm-hmm. What about, using the chairman's words of earlier, the bigger issue, namely that the Horizon system may be proved to lack integrity, which may have a consequential impact on criminal convictions?
Quite, but I hadn't really seen any. So during that 2 years' worth of discussion about the litigation case, over those 2 years, we weren't getting any information from the GC that the risk of the case itself had gone up. We were told there was nothing new, particularly in the claims, and of course we hadn't seen the SWIFT report. So I was unsighted on some of those issues that were in that, which is why I was of the view I stated in my witness statement about the underlying status of Horizon. The risk here, I think, represents increasing tension as board members transition, as we're trying to get a information sharing protocol in place and Post Office not being very cooperative, and the risk ultimately getting nearer and people thinking, oh, well, hang on, I think, probably. So I think that's what's that is what explains the change in risk rating.
And so, can I summarise your answer and tell me if I'm incorrect? The risk of the Post Office losing the claim and that having an impact on the integrity of Horizon and the possibility of that having an impact on criminal convictions was such a low risk that it didn't even deserve to be included on a risk register?
Well, clearly it should have been, but no, it wasn't. We were very much focused on the litigation. And I suppose inherently the risk you've just set out is kind of in that risk somewhere, even if it's not.
Where is it included?
Well, it's not direct. It's not explicitly setting that risk. It's probably,
this seems to be about process issues,
yeah.
Satellite issues.
Yeah.
It's a bolt-ons to the main issue.
No,
I'm asking, why do we never see in any of these an assessment of the big issue or the big issues?
It's a good question. I think, as I've said in my witness statement, on reflection, we should have got a merits opinion, all those sorts of things, and been more proactive.
But why didn't you?
I suppose, why didn't I? Because, generally speaking, government's position up until, well, not this point, but prior to late 17, had always been to be quite hands-off and leave it as a matter for courts and the arm's length body. It wasn't until the Magnox study that lessons learned that UKGI did, where they were involved in another case where it was stated they should be more proactive. So I think.
But Mr. Callard, even if the government's attitude is that this is an arm's length body,
yep.
The matters concerned are operational in nature, and there's an element to which we, government, should not get involved because there's either an independent mediation scheme or litigation.
Yeah.
There's still a risk to the perhaps existence of the Post Office or the proper functioning of the Post Office if things go badly in the course of those mediations or
yes. But
litigation.
Yeah.
Why do we see none of that recorded?
Well, because I didn't see anything that changed my the information that I was getting didn't change my view that essentially there hadn't been an issue with Horizon found which causes losses to sub-postmasters. So I hadn't seen any new information, and when I asked about that, and when Jane McLeod gave her updates at board about those sorts of things, there was never any discussion that, oh, by the way, we found an issue about balancing transactions as set out in the SWIFT report. So my view on the technicalities and merits, I suppose, of what I understood, I mean, merits not in a legal sense, but my understanding of what had been found, say, 1 to 2 years prior hadn't changed. So I didn't think the risk, the underlying point that you're saying that there was a underlying problem with Horizon, I didn't think that risk had particularly changed.
Isn't there a
which is wrong? I accept that that's wrong.
Even if that was your view, ought it to have been recorded?
On reflection, yes, but my point here is that the risk register is a sort of, it's not a formal, to my mind anyway, it's not a formal record as such. It doesn't, although it obviously goes up to EXCO and the board, it was, from my perspective, it was more a sort of record of, or a way of encapsulating the risks as we saw it as a team. And inherently in those risks, there are lots of other issues behind them that we may be working on and dealing with, which are not set out specifically in that wording.
Thank you. Can we take the second morning break? It's just coming up to 20 past.
Yeah.
12:30, please.
Certainly.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Callard, can we turn to reporting to ministers, please, as a topic? and start by looking at poll 306-5473. And if we go to page 5, please. And if we scroll down, please. We'll see this is an email there, if we stop there, from Jane McLeod. If we scrolled up, we would see that it was to Paula Venables on the 2nd of April, 2015. It's you're not included on the distribution list, but there's a comment made about you, which is why I'm asking you. It says, we, that's Jane McLeod, are meeting with Laura tomorrow. That's Laura of the SheEx, yes?
Yep. Yes.
So that we can review where we've got to. Laura and Richard Callard are briefing Lady Neville Rolfe on Tuesday on another matter, and Laura is concerned that Sparrow will come up. Do you see that?
Yes.
So we're mid-2015, a prospective briefing of Baroness Neville Rolfe and by you and Laura, and it's recorded by Jane McLeod that Laura was concerned that Sparrow would come up. Why would SheEx be worried that Project Sparrow would come up in a discussion with a minister?
Could you just clarify what month this was?
August 2015.
August. I don't think we were. I mean, we saw Baroness Neville Rolfe almost weekly on other matters, usually being Green Investment Bank, and I don't think we were particularly concerned if it came up.
Was there any sense that you, SheEx, had to formulate lines with Post Office before briefing ministers?
No, not necessarily, but we would check with Post Office whether they are factually accurate, for example. And we would ask, I mean, no doubt what Laura is meaning here is Baroness Neville Rolfe may well ask about Sparrow, what's the latest, depending on what was happening around that time. I think if it's August 15, I think they were about to, Jane McLeod and Paula Venables were due to meet Baroness Neville Rolfe on the 6th of August, I think. So it could have been in preparation for that.
To what extent did you and SheEx adopt Post Office lines when reporting to the minister?
We would report our own lines, but they would be sometimes similar to Post Office lines because they would be based on what we understood the facts to be from Post Office.
Would you sometimes, in agreement with the Post Office, keep information from the Permanent Secretary or the Minister?
No, not with the express intent of withholding it.
Would you decide when it was necessary to provide the Minister with information in your own judgment?
Yes, that's up to us to decide.
And you would draw that as a distinction between keeping information from the Minister?
Yes, because you don't want to go to a minister half-cocked if you don't understand the full facts, for example.
In your witness statement at paragraph 67, maybe we should turn it up, please. It's page 34 of your witness statement. Page 34, please. Fourth line of paragraph 67, you say, as to Horizon, I also felt I had been doing a reasonably good job of preventing the Minister from being criticised publicly in relation to Horizon, which I saw as part of my role. And just stopping there, do you mean part of your role as a NED?
No. As a part of my role as a civil servant is to deal with and protect ministers from undue or sometimes due criticism.
But how did that sit with your role as a NED? Where
Well, it didn't. No. That was with my civil servant hat on.
what about if you needed to, as part of the board,
Needed to what? Sorry.
say that we have suggested X or Y to the government and they have failed to deliver?
Sorry, I don't quite understand.
Yes, you were part of a board
Yes.
of a company
Yep.
that might not always agree with what the government was doing
Yes.
in relation to that company.
That's correct.
Where did your loyalty sit in that situation?
Well, that's when it gets quite difficult, and you try and make the case of government to the board. So, for example, that happened quite a lot around mutualisation and those sorts of issues back in 2014.
You continue, and that's what I was referring to when I said we had kept a lid on things. That's in an email that we're going to look at in a moment.
Yes.
As I explain further below, our overarching approach in relation to Horizon was that this was an issue for Post Office to address, and there was no real role for government to play, particularly in the absence, as we understood it, of any evidence of a fault with Horizon that might have caused losses in branch accounts. That overarching approach, how long did, i.e. that Horizon was an issue for Post Office and not for government, how long did that overarching approach last?
I think it lasted throughout my tenure. I'd inherited it. We'd reconfirmed it in 2015 when the new government came in. And it sort of continued through to when I left.
Knowing what you know now, do you consider that the overarching approach was an appropriate one?
I sort of wrestle with this a little bit. I'm not sure, because I'm not quite sure what else government could do to insert itself into the situation and to have essentially resolved the situation. I'm not sure what government could have done, so I'm not sure what I would have suggested.
Can we go, please, to the email, UKGI 406454? An email from you to Richard Parker, to Tim Parker of the 18th of January 2016. Second paragraph, the under-provisioning of sub-postmasters' compensation issue has worried Baroness Neville Rolfe, perhaps disproportionately so. Stopping there, the under-provisioning of compensation to sub-postmasters, is that a recognition that by you that in fact sub-postmasters had been under-provisioned in terms of compensation?
This is an entirely separate matter where the business had misstated its accounts. It's made a mistake in its accounts. The provisioning is about compensation to sub-postmasters as part of the network transformation programme. They hadn't pulled up through the right figure and the accounts were wrong. And Baroness Neville Rolfe was very worried about that, naturally.
And is that established by the fact that the subject of this is Remco?
Possibly, because it might be that, look, there's been a bit of a mess up there, what we're doing about it. But I'm not quite sure why it's about Remco. In the bottom of that second paragraph, I would happy share drafts in
And so this isn't to do with Horizon?
No, this is about retrospective action. Why has there been an accounting problem? And it was, we had to restate, the business had to restate its annual accounts, which is obviously wrong and embarrassing because it pulled the wrong figures through from its account, from its underlying source documentation from a spreadsheet.
Can we see also from the third paragraph from the bottom that you deal separately with the issue of Sparrow?
Yep.
And does that help to establish that the second paragraph is about the issue that you've mentioned rather than compensation to sub-postmasters for
Yes,
Horizon issues?
Yes, I think so, because I'm saying it's also about Sparrow, in addition to what we've just talked about in the second paragraph.
You say in any event that you have sought to keep a lid on it in the first sentence or the first line of the second paragraph, in what way had you sought to keep a lid on that issue? Even though it is a separate issue.
I think that means just having dealt with it. So I think Baroness Errol Rolfe was very worried about the mistake in the accounts. I thought perhaps disproportionately so, because the submission I'd put to her about it consisted of two things. One was a cost overrun on IT, which was real money, and this, which was just an accounting error. And it hadn't actually meant postmasters hadn't received the compensation they wanted. It was just Post Office hadn't forecast properly in their accounts what it was, but underlying that, they knew that they would have to pay. So of the two errors I reported to her around that time, one was a real cash cost and one wasn't. This one wasn't, hence my disproportionately so comment.
Thank you. So this is a reflection, albeit on a separate issue, of you acting in a way that either gave or withheld information from Baroness Neville Rolfe, is that right?
Well, I didn't withhold any information from her. No, this is saying I've given her a submission about what's gone wrong. Of the two issues, she reacted to one of this issue rather more strongly than the other issue, which surprised me, because the other issue was about real money and real cost overrun. This was just an accounting error that had no cash implications.
I think, thank you, that can come down. I think you do agree, however, that you, on occasion, got the balance wrong in making decisions as to whether or not ministers should or should not be provided with information.
Probably.
I think it's in your witness statement,
yeah, I'm sure it is.
page 36.
Right.
It reads to me as a bit of an admission.
Okay, well, yes, I'm not saying that.
Page 36 of your witness statement.
Yep.
It will come up on the screen, paragraph 70.
Oh, yes. Yes. Got you.
Page 36, paragraph 70. Whilst I did my best to do so, my job is subjective. I acknowledge there were times where I got the balance wrong. One example is provided by an email exchange in March 15, where I agree with other members of the shareholder team that there were dangers in the Minister, Joe Swinson, receiving a copy of the second site thematic report, and then you give the reference. In essence, I agree with the advice of Laura Thompson that the Minister and government should maintain its independence here. And I expressed that view in an offhand reply. It would be bonkers for the Minister to compromise that independence, which we had considered a key part of the scheme, by receiving the report in circumstances where she might then be required to express a view and potentially take a side. So this is you essentially saying that you acknowledge that you got it wrong in trying to dissuade the Minister from seeing the second site report, yes, the thematic report.
Yes, I think my concerns were legitimate, but, you know, on reflection, yes, you probably should see it. One should see it.
You explain it as an attempt to draw the right line by letting the Post Office have the freedom to deal with operational matters, essentially.
Basically, because if she receives that report, we spent quite a long time, including my predecessors as well, in maintaining this operational independence line. Once the report's received, she has to take a view on it, and that's going to be very difficult for her, potentially.
But at this point, the second site had been sacked in controversial circumstances.
I'm not sure I agree with that particular characterisation of it.
What had happened?
Well, so the way the mediation scheme, this is by March 2015, the mediation scheme was progressing, and Post Office had done all of its investigations into the cases. Second Sight were retained to finish their investigations into those cases and to report their thematic, to produce their thematic report. So I guess it was controversial. It was received controversially, but to my mind, it was the conclusion of the mediation scheme, and that was that essentially. Because I knew that it would create tension.
In what way would the Minister having a copy of the Second Sight report involve her in operational matters?
Well, if she had a copy of the report, she'd have to read it. If she reads it, she then's got to take a view, and she either has to decide...
Why does she have to take a view?
Well, I suppose she doesn't, but if she's asked by...
No, that's a fundamental part of your answer. If she reads a document, she has to take a view.
Well, there'd been a number of difficult parliamentary debates where she'd managed them very well. If she reads the report, someone will say to her, well, what do you think of it? Is there a case here to be dealt with, or is there not? And the way this was a very polarised topic, whichever answer she gave, people would find fault with it, which I thought, as a person trying to keep her away from criticism and trying to protect her, I thought...
So, Mr. Callard, if a document addresses a difficult issue about which there is more than one view, that means the Minister shouldn't see it because she might have to take a view about it.
No, that's not what I'm saying. So I'm saying that there is a risk that that's what she ends up being asked to do, and that because we'd agreed that this was an operational matter, and that was the agreed position, which she had agreed as part of, before I'd even got there, it was an extension of that position, or a continuation of that position. And I'm trying to flag to her the risk that if you essentially break that position, then you're exposed to risk. Sorry, to finish off, she basically overruled me, which I'm saying on reflection was right.
Doesn't your approach show a fundamental conflict within the ALB model between the wishing to be seen independent, as independent on the one hand, and yet if advice like this is given and acted upon, oversight cannot be exercised in any meaningful way?
Can you just repeat the two?
Yes. Government wish to be independent and seen to be independent of the Post Office.
Yes.
And leave operational matters to the Post Office.
Yes.
Did that approach mean that it could never effectively exercise any oversight?
I don't think it means never, but I think what we're trying to get at here is that they are best placed to deal with it, because, as I said before, it's quite hard to understand how government would insert itself into this situation to resolve it.
Had you not been overruled, government would never have seen the report?
Possibly not, no.
Can we look, please, at what another minister says, Joe Swinson says, about information that was not provided to her, by looking at the document itself, to start with, UKGI 402439. This is just a covering email to an attachment because the attachment isn't dated, and so I'm using this to date the attachment. It's an email from you, again, to the Swinson generic address, yes? And it's a...
Yes. Ah, right, yes, sorry.
Addressed to Claire.
Yes.
Can you help us to identify who that would have been within
She'll be one
a
of
private office?
A private office person, yeah.
Thanks for the discussion today, very helpful. I've attached the note I mentioned. Alice saw the first iteration. Would that be, who would that be?
Alice Perkins.
Okay. I've just sent this second iteration to her and thought it might be expedient that you see it sooner rather than later. I'd be grateful if you could flag any potential red flags in here. This is not a speaking note as such, it's too long for that. Something to get some thoughts in some sort of order and gives you the general gist of our arguments. If you do have a word with Joe prior to the meeting, I'd be grateful for any readout. So can you give us the context for this, please?
So we were preparing for a meeting with Joe Swinson, we being, I think, Mark Russell, my CEO, and I. We had provided advice to both Jenny Willett and then Joe Swinson about the replacement of the CFO. Mm-hmm. Ministers had rejected that replacement on the basis that they were happy with the salary and the sort of golden handshake, but they objected to the payment of notice for the exiting CFO. So
Mr. Day.
Mr. Day, yes. So on the basis they rejected that, Mark and I thought we should go and see Jo Swinson to try and change her mind, because it was very important to get a new CFO. And that's obviously very difficult, going to see a minister to ask them to change their mind when they've already opined.
Thank you. Can we look at the attachment, please? UKGI 402440. And just look at the top half of the page. And so you said in the covering email, this isn't a speaking note, but it's the gist of your arguments, and your arguments being SheEx's arguments.
Well, it's my arguments, it's my notes, but essentially, yes, what I was planning to say, and it's a way of getting my thoughts in order by writing it down.
Opening gambit, as you know, SheEx and the board are clear that the current CFO, that's Chris Day, is not the right person to take the company forward given the challenges it faces. Skipping over, all that, and on reflection, we should have approached you earlier. We want to explain to you why we need to come to see you on this, and why Alison, the chair of Remco, want to meet you and Vince. That's Vince Cable, yes?
Yes.
The difficulties on the CFO front have brought forward the concerns that the board and SheEx has about the CEO. That's Paula Venables.
Yes.
Which you need to be aware of, and which puts the appointment of a new CFO in a wider context. The board's concern over the poor performance of the CEO has been growing for some time, and has only recently got to the point where it feels it needs to act in due course. I'm going to ask you this afternoon about some questions concerning Paula Venables' position within the company and what action you and others took about it.
Okay.
But this leaves the board in a difficult place. Removing a CEO without a competent CFO capable of holding the fort is a big risk. This makes replacing the CFO all the more important. We need to obtain a strong CFO, give them time to feel their feet, get their feet under the table before acting on the CEO. Without replacing both of them, the plan is a significant risk. It's extremely sensitive and highly confidential. And then you sort of ask yourself a question, the type of which you would imagine a minister to ask you. Is that right?
Yes.
And give yourself the answers. Mm-hmm. Why haven't you told me about the CEO before? Why didn't it form part of the CFO advice? Pregnant in those questions is the truth. Is that right, that you hadn't told the minister about any concerns involving the CEO before then?
No. She'd been, I suppose, the worries about Paula had been growing since I joined in January, February. Jo Swinson had been on maternity leave for most of that time. Admittedly, I didn't have a conversation with her replacement, Jenny Willett, either. But no, as I say here somewhere, that this has kind of grown over time, and it's kind of starting to crystallise now.
So you hadn't told the minister, whether in the person of Jo Swinson or her replacement, about any concerns about Paula Venables before this point?
No, because as I say in the first bullet of that section, it's a very dangerous and destabilising thing to do. Because in the second bullet, your relationship with her is irrevocably damaged. And I think that in the early times of my tenure, I didn't have enough evidence to substantiate any worries. And this is double-edged. If I tell ministers early, I irrevocably damage and put doubt in their mind about their relationship with their CEO, which, if I'm wrong, is hard to unwind. So you have to be quite sure of your ground.
And the third bullet point, you say the board has been monitoring the situation for some time. Until recently, we felt the balance of risk pointed towards keeping Paula in place. There are a number of reasons why the balance has changed. Efforts to improve her performance have failed. Board is increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress on various areas, primarily the lack of grip and pace applied to revenue growth, cost cutting, specific business areas like Horizon and the strategy in general. Yeah. Can I ask you now, before we get to the questions specifically about Ms. Venables this afternoon, what was the board's concern at this point, specifically over her approach in relation to business areas like Horizon?
I think it was a reflection of the fact that the response to the second site interim report seemed to be along the right lines in terms of a mediation scheme, etc. But it had been rather badly managed to the point where a year on, it's actually a cause of great difficulty. And whilst I don't think she was personally responsible for that, it was a reflection of the lack of general grip that we felt she might have on the business, because things like the terms of reference with Second Sight I don't think had been agreed. I think the mediation scheme had been announced hastily, and it was things like that that made us doubt that.
You say this crystallised the June away day, where Paula Venables very much sat back and let her team lead. She acts more like a non-executive director than somebody who leads from the front.
Yes.
Was that your own view or the view of the entirety of Post Office Board?
I think that most of us felt like that, particularly we talk about in here, it started to crystallise, the board's views crystallised during that time, because during those discussions she tended to ask questions of the people who were presenting the strategy, when actually it's, as an executive leading, it's her strategy too, and she should be putting the case forward.
If we go over the page, please. What's wrong with the CEO? It's about grip and pace. She has many strengths, but given Post Office's increasingly competitive environment and the strategy it must implement, we need stronger leadership and vision. We need a better grip on detail. We need more traction on the ground to deliver cost savings and revenue growth at pace. A number of examples include, then the third bullet point, issues like Horizon, mediation scheme and financial services have required significantly more oversight by the board than one might expect, as things haven't been gripped to the point where the board have set up subcommittees when it should be Paula or the CFO. Is that a reference to a litigation subcommittee?
No, that's the Sparrow subcommittee of 2014, which was set up to essentially give the board more bandwidth to think about how to deal with the emerging problems of the mediation scheme.
And was it the board's view that that ought to have been led by the CEO and or the CFO?
Well, I think the board's view is that we shouldn't have had to get to that point where we're setting up a committee to deal with it.
Scrolling down. Would a CEO require higher remuneration? Answer, yes. What have you done to put measures in place to improve her performance? Alice has spent an enormous amount of time coaching, mentoring and monitoring Paula. Alice has significant net experience. Paula responded to initial efforts, but this levelled off and is ultimately about character and aptitude. Why are we paying her big bucks if she isn't performing? Her base pay is in the bottom quartile of a cross-section of CEOs. Over the page. Again, a question that you thought that Joe Swinson might ask you. I remember Alice asking to increase Paula's pay, that she was doing well at that point, responding to coaching that Alice and the board were giving. Third bullet point, since that point, Paula has proactively said to Alice she wants to stay to see transformation through. And then a challenge, don't see how that has got anything to do with the CFO. Scroll down, please. Some questions about the CFO. Keep scrolling, please. And over the page. Lastly, ministers have made their decision. This is of great concern to the board, who are personally responsible to you and the Secretary of State for the successful running of the business, and it's their view that a change is needed. you're effectively saying you don't have confidence in their judgment on these matters, which is a very difficult position for the non-execs and chair to be in. So the ministers have made their decision. What does that refer to?
That refers to, pretty sure it refers to, they were not prepared to pay Chris Day's exit payment, which meant we couldn't, as a board, move Chris on because he hadn't performed so badly that he could be fired. And we had Al Cameron waiting in the wings, and we wanted to bring him in. He wasn't going to wait forever. But ministers have made the decision they didn't want to pay that exit payment, and we are trying to persuade her to change her mind at this point.
Did you present to Jo Swinson your case in accordance with this non-speaking note?
I think I probably did so. I recall the meeting was supposed to be for half an hour, and it lasted 90 minutes or something like that. It was quite a long meeting. And given the volume of stuff in there about the CEO, I think I probably would have done. We were essentially in the position where we were sort of trying to throw the kitchen sink at this to kind of get ministers to change their mind, because that's very hard to do.
And is it fair to say that a part of SheEx's approach was specifically, as the CEO Paula Venel's lack of grip and pace over Horizon issues?
I don't think Horizon was the lead thing, if that was indicative. I think it was more around the strategy, as it mentioned on the first page, the strategy, the sort of revenue growth, cost reduction, those sorts of things, and the general kind of Ned-like stance that she would take.
And by Ned-like stance, do you mean an outsider?
Well, kind of asking the same, a board asking similar questions that a Ned might ask, when actually other chief executives that I've seen operate come in and they almost present their colleagues' sort of individual strategies, and they take the lead, and it's them telling the board what's going on rather than asking questions of her team.
Can we look at what Jo Swinson says about this? WITN 10190100. Page 21, please. Paragraph 45 onwards, I'm going to read between paragraphs 45 and 47 so you get the complete context. I've been shown by the inquiry an undated briefing note. That's the document I've just showed you, the one ending in 440. It seems to have been attached to an email of the 20th of August 2014. That's the email I showed you. I understand, seeing it now, that this appears to have been written by you as points or prompts for Alice Perkins in advance of a call scheduled between her and me to help her to try and convince me to ask the Treasury for permission to recruit a new CFO, Alistair Cameron, on a very high salary to replace Chris Day. Is that right? Was that the purpose of the document?
My understanding of the document, no. So my understanding of the document is that it was a speaking note for me when I was accompanying Mark Russell to talk to Jo Swinson about this, and that it wasn't to persuade her to pay a high salary. That had been, I think, not agreed but not objected to. What had been objected to is the exit payment. I think it was payment for failure she used the term of. It's the exit payment that was objectionable to, I think, Jenny Willett and then Jo, not the salary.
She continues, in the light of government finances at the time and the austerity measures in place, any appointment using public money to a role above a certain level of remuneration required Treasury approval. I did not see this document at the time. Indeed, it was not something ever designed for me to see, as the covering email and the contents of the note make clear, e.g. the fact that the note is structured as a series of responses to questions I might ask. It seems that Richard Callard was asking my private office for advice on how Alice Perkins could make the points in the note to me in a way that would be most persuasive, and he anticipated I would not be happy.
Yeah.
Quote, I'd be grateful if you could flag any potential red flags in here. Is that right? You were asking her private office on how Alice Perkins could make points in a way that might land?
No, I think I'm asking how. Yeah, I think I'm saying to the private office, I'm going to say this stuff. Is there anything? Clearly, there probably will be difficult pushback, because Jo Swinson was very hot on executive pay. I think what I'm saying, my message to private office was, this is broadly what I'm going to say. Can you know Joe better than I do? Can you flag?
So it's about you speaking to the minister rather than Alice
That's
Perkins.
how I interpret it.
Okay, on to paragraph 46, please. I was shocked to read this note. It seems to show Mr. Callard, a SHE-Ex official, who was one of the key officials who was supposed to support me in my ministerial role with regard to post office matters, instead using his departmental position, access and contacts to work on behalf of Post Office to seek to persuade me what to do what Post Office wanted, contrary to wider government policy on pay restraint. It also makes clear that he had deliberately kept me in the dark about the concerns SHE-Ex had about Paula Vennell's performance. Just stop there then. Firstly, were you using your departmental position, access and contacts to work on behalf of Post Office in a way that was contrary to government policy on pay restraint?
I don't think so, because we were very clear in the submission to ministers about what that pay is, and they had already opined on it. Senior executive remuneration is one of the most difficult bits of the shareholder executive UKGI job, because our assets have to fish in the private sector market, and you want to get the best CEO that you can do, and CFO, which is what we're trying to do here. The shareholder executive was aligned with the board in terms of trying to get a new CFO in, and it didn't seem to us value for money that you wouldn't pay, I can't remember what the exit payment was, but that you wouldn't pay something in the very tens of thousands to remove Chris Day if you could bring in a CFO who may save multiples of that money over the course of the next few years in implementing Post Office's strategy.
Is it right that you deliberately kept from her, i.e. kept her in the dark, concerns that SHE-Ex had about Miss Vennell's performance?
I think I explained that in the note, that basically you have to wait until you're sure. We weren't sure until the June away day, and it's damaging to put doubt in Joe Swinson or any minister's mind about that before you are sure. And also, frankly, I wasn't around until the end of June, back till the end of June.
This was sent to her private office, but wasn't ever intended for her to see.
It wasn't intended for her, but I wasn't hiding anything, because otherwise I wouldn't send it to her private office. In fact, I think at the bottom of that email, if you do talk to Joe about it, I mean, don't show the note, but you can share the sentiment of the note and let me know if there's any red flags coming back.
So was this you attempting to pitch your argument in the best way possible by testing the water with private office before speaking face to face with the minister?
Yes, because a private office understand what minister they know their ministers pretty well, and so will have a sense of what they're going to react to and how they're going to react. So I think there's other instances in my timeline where I sort of share things with private office, say, how will this float? I'm trying to get your advice on how do I pitch this, given the objective I'm trying to achieve. I'm trying to get their advice.
Lastly, before the lunch break, can we look at a second passage in Ms. Swinson's witness statement?
Yep.
Page 52, paragraph 128. If we just scroll down a bit. Ms. Swinson says, I do wish I had asked to meet second sight, though I'm pretty certain if I had that SHE-Ex would have told me this was not possible due to operational independence. I feel let down by a failure of briefing from SHE-Ex. Richard Callard was on the board and knew what was going on for months, with steps towards sacking second sight and the closure of the working group, but he didn't tell me. I was repeatedly advised in briefings it was an operational matter, so not one for me to be involved in. But looking back, it was not clear that the Post Office Board or anyone else was conducting an adequate oversight function. Did you discuss with the Minister whether she should meet with second sight?
I may have done, but I can't recall.
Can you therefore not recall whether you gave advice to or not to meet with second sight?
Yeah, correct. I can't remember.
Did you keep the Minister informed of what she describes as the steps towards the sacking of Second Sight?
Well, I think she says elsewhere in her witness statement that I showed her a board paper, I think. And there is, I can't remember it now, but there is stuff in my chain where you can see that this decision is coming. And we appreciate it's a very difficult decision. So I don't think the submission we put to her on, I think it's the 4th of March 2015, it shouldn't have come as a complete surprise, because we were essentially giving her some information that was what was going to be coming her way.
Thank you. Sir, it's 1:10 now. I wonder whether we might break until 1:55.
Yep. Fine.
Thank you very much, sir.